Chapter 11. "What's the matter, John? You look like you've seen a ghost," Mitch asked, a worried frown clouding his face. "You might say that," John replied, shaking his head slowly, not once removing his gaze from his father's hard features. All of the dreams from his childhood were crashing through his mind. Only now, both his parents had faces, and his memories of face were all bad. He must have blanked out his father's image. Was it because of the nightmare? Did he really see it happen, and pushed it deep down into the recesses of his mind, only for it to come back and haunt him in his dreams? A hand on his shoulder shook him from his trance. "Hey, what's the matter?" Mitch asked again, clearly concerned. "You were right in a way. You could say I have seen a ghost. The woman next to Roy was my aunt, and the couple next to her were my parents." Although he knew his mother was dead, John was having serious doubts about his father. "I've got something to tell you," John began, "but you must promise to keep an open mind." "Hey, I promise," Mitch shot back, but unsure if he would be able to keep the promise. John told him the story. The whole story. At first, he wasn't sure just how much he was going to tell Mitch. But once he had started, there was no stopping. The floodgates had been opened, and he decided that if he was going to tell Mitch anything, then it might as well be the entire story, leaving nothing out. And the entire story was told. From his childhood, the deaths of his parents, the trips with Roy, the nightmares that had plagued him as a child, and plagued him again as soon as he had returned to the house. He told Mitch about Cindy employing him, about the death of Henry Woods after he had spoken to him, about running Cindy down, only to find her turned into a rat, about the incident in the bathtub, and finally, about not remembering what his father had looked like until now, and that he now realized that the face of his father and the face of the monster from his dreams were one and the same. And he told Mitch that maybe, just maybe, his father could still be alive, and that it was he and Roy who were behind the crimes. It had taken over an hour for John to relay his story, and Mitch hadn't interrupted once. John felt naked and exposed now that he had finally finished, and it seemed that Mitch still didn't have anything to say. "Well, say it. Tell me that I'm a raving loony, and it's time you were leaving." "Hey, hold on. I'm not going to say you're a raving loony," Mitch slowly stated, "but I do need a little while to think this over." The anger that had quickly boiled up in John eased off. What had he expected? That Mitch would say, "I believe you. Now let's go and get those two sons of bitches." He realized that that was exactly what he had expected. But deep down, he wasn't surprised that Mitch had reacted the way he did. If someone had told him the same story, and then he would have behaved in the same way. No, if the truth were known, he would have acted different. He wouldn't have been so polite about it. "Look, don't take this the wrong way, but I do have to be going, and you have given me a lot to think about, and I do promise I will view it with an open mind." John looked hard at Mitch and realized instantly that he was telling the truth. If Mitch was going to call him a nutcase, then at least he would know that he had thought long and hard before coming to that conclusion. "Yay, maybe I'll see you later," John said lamely. "I've got a bit of work on my desk to clear, but you can count on it," Mitch pledged, rising from his chair. When Mitch reached his office, he brushed the files that were scattered across his desk to one side and laid down the ones he had collected from records on the way up. He found all he could on the missing children from the 60s and on the recent cases. If there was any link, then he was going to find it. He had also discovered reports about the accident that had killed John's parents. He had promised that he was going to view what John had told him with an open mind, and he intended to do just that. Although he had only known John for a couple of days, Mitch was certain that it had taken on hell of a nerve to tell him, and what he had told him was the truth. Or at least, what John believed it to be the truth, which was pretty much the same thing in his eyes. And although John had thought that Mitch regarded him as a loony, he didn't. He had heard a lot of strange things in his years as a reporter, some really strange things, where you would expect the person involved to be carted off to the nearest funny farm. But when he had delved into their stories, he hadn't found anything to disprove them. These things, over the years, had turned him from a complete non-believer of the unexplained to, let's say, a semi-believer. He had certainly heard some wilder cases than this, so this story at least deserved looking into. After all, it might make a great headline story. He studied the case histories in the papers. Then when he had finished, he studied them again. One thing that struck him was the fact that they all were young and all lived in a 20-mile radius of Buckley, which in itself were unusual. After all, Buckley was just a small Welsh town, not bloody LA. This type of crime was unusual for Britain, full stop. So why was it that no one was sitting up and taking notice now? Even to him, it was clear that something very odd was going on. And like 30 years ago, children were disappearing from the Buckley area again. So why was no one taking any bloody notice? He rubbed his head with a sweaty hand and sighed inwardly. It was news, bloody big news. So why wasn't anyone covering it more deeply? Why hadn't he? Well, if no one was going to cover it, then he sure as hell was going to. Whether or not John was telling the truth, Mitch knew that he was the key. He didn't know how, but he did know that if he could turn him the right way, then the door would open and they could blow this case wide apart. As he sat staring at the outline of his well-chewed nails, he suddenly had an image spring to mind. An image that sent cold shockwaves down the entire length of his spine. It was an image of his torn and mangled body being dragged through the field to the open grave that he had seen being dug earlier. John had decided that a rest was in order as soon as Mitch left. The morning's events were beginning to take their toll. Although he was tired, sleep didn't come easy. He had gone for shit or bust when he had told Mitch his story, and he had no way of knowing just how he had taken it. Maybe he should have got to know Mitch better first, after all. He had only just met him, and maybe he was only in it for the story. Well, if that was what he was after, then he had given him a story to get his teeth into. When John thought about it, he realized that he hadn't had any other choice but to tell Mitch, because he reckoned that there just wasn't that much time left to play. Get to know ya. He didn't know how long he lay on top of the bed before he finally dropped off, and he didn't know how long he had managed to sleep before a loud hammering on the door brought him back into the present. But he was glad the knocking came when it did. His dream was starting to turn nasty. It wasn't the dream. It was a new one, with a new cast, and once more he felt lost and helpless. The knocking came just in time to stop him from seeing what happened to Mitch, whose limp body was being dragged through the wet grass up in the field. He knew it was the field, because now he could smell it. He staggered downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes, nearly falling more than once. As he opened the door, Mitch's smiling face was a welcome sight indeed. He hadn't really been sure if he would see him again. "I'm sorry if I got you out of bed. Can I come in?" "I haven't been to bed. I just had a lie down," snapped John on the defensive. "Hey, I don't blame you for being tired after all the shit you've been through," Mitch commented, throwing up his hands. John wasn't sure if he was being sincere or just humoring him. I'm sorry if I bit your head off. I guess I'm still tired. John stepped to one side to let his visitor in. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I would see you again in a hurry, he went on as he shut the door. Why? Because you're a raving loony? There was no danger of that. Even if I didn't believe what you told me, I'd still have come back just for the story. Mitch laughed. Although he had made light of it, John knew that he spoke the truth, which was something he didn't often hear from a reporter. So what are you saying that you believe me? Well, I'm not saying I believe you, Mitch began. Then, seeing the look on John's face, he hurried on. But I'm not saying I don't believe you. Then just what the hell are you saying? John demanded. I'm saying just that. That while I'm not a firm believer in it, I'm not a disbeliever either. Believer in it, John smiled, raising an eyebrow. You know what I mean, the paranormal. So you think this is paranormal, do you? John teased, riding him now. Well, you sure as hell think something is going on, and I don't know about you, but it doesn't sound bloody normal to me, Mitch yelled, his face turning a dull purple. John could see the anger in Mitch, but wasn't about to let up. So now that we've established that it is something weird, what do you suggest? Call in Spooky Mulder and tell him we've got another X-file for him. He spat the words out. Well, not quite, but maybe the next best thing. The next best thing? And what the hell would be the next best thing? John asked, getting interested despite himself. I'm not really on speaking terms with old Spooky, but it just so happens I do know someone who might be able to help us. Mitch snapped back. Oh, it's US. Well, is it us when they start dishing out the straitjackets? Okay, shithead, just listen. She's a professional psychic. I met her while doing some research into fake fortune tellers, and as I said, she might just be able to help. John stared at him as if he was the bearer of news that the world was going to end in 5 minutes. I don't believe what I'm hearing. He shook his head in disbelief. It's quite simple. You tell her what you told me, and we'll take it from there. I'm beginning to regret telling you. I expected some kind of a reaction from you, but Christ, not this. John paced frantically round the room, stopping now and then to see if Mitch was still there, and not just another one of his dreams. No way, he yelled. No bloody way. Listen here, you fucking selfish bastard. Try thinking of others instead of you, Mitch exploded. John stopped his pacing, as though he had just walked into a brick wall. He hadn't thought of anything except making a fool of himself, but now Mitch's harsh words etched into his brain and made it start working again. Who was he to say no, to not be willing to try anything, to get to the bottom of this thing, and more importantly, to not put a stop to the disappearances of innocent children? He felt like kicking himself. How could he be so blind? He now knew beyond doubt, by the way Mitch's true feelings emerged in his outburst, that he wasn't just in it for the story. John gazed into Mitch's furious face and suddenly felt drained. Okay, I'm sorry, he offered feebly. Who is she? Her name's Matilda Joy. She lives just on the outskirts of Chester. Well, that's, a pretty normalized name, John laughed, trying to ease the icy atmosphere. Actually, she does go by a different name, but I can't for the life of me remember what it is, though. Mitch also broke into laughter, washing away any of the frost that was left between them. So when do you want to go and see her? How about now? How do you know she's going to be in? Well, I phoned her before I came over, Mitch explained, and then cringed. John shot him a look, but said nothing, within 5 minutes, which is how long it took John to make him presentable. At least he thought he looked presentable. They were on their way to Hoole. Hoole was on the other side of Chester, but a lot easier to get into than Chester. It was straight up the bypass, so in less than 20 minutes after they had left John's cottage, they were knocking on the door of a semi-detached house in the richer part of town. It's not really what I expected. I pictured some spooky little place in the middle of nowhere. John whispered out of the side of his mouth as he listened to the footsteps drawing closer. Mitch didn't have time to reply before the door was flung open with a theatrical gesture. "Oh, Mitch, it is good to see you again," the woman exclaimed, throwing her arms about the startled reporter. John couldn't take his eyes off her. She was the most bewitching person he had ever come across. She could easily be taken for a famous film actress. John tried, but couldn't decide if she was older or younger than him. Her smile and hers eyes lit up like a child's, but a mature presence was all around her. John opted for her being about the same age as him. Well, it was convenient. She had the fairest skin he had ever seen, and wasn't wearing a stitch of makeup. No false eyelashes, no deep rouge on her cheeks, no big splodge of lipstick, nothing. And she still looked like a model. "I'd like you to meet my friend John." John, staring, mesmerized into her deep hazel eyes, suddenly realized he was being spoken to. "Oh, I'm sorry. Pleased to meet you," he mumbled, shaking the outstretched hand. The hand felt warm and comforting, and he held on to it a little longer than expected, reluctant to give it back. When he realized what he was doing, he flushed a deep red. The woman gave them a broad smile and invited them in. The interior of the house was a lot different from the outside, and John felt as though he had just stepped through a portal. The whole of the hall was in a dark gloom. The colors made him feel as though the walls and ceiling were closing in on him. Although the outside was quite suburban, the inside was on the exotic side. The ornaments that were scattered along the shelves and hanging from the walls were all symbolic of witchcraft, voodoo, and other pagan beliefs. John felt a shudder crawl down his back and had a sudden foreboding about being in the house, and no matter how hard he tried to fight it, this sense of foreboding just would not sit still. She opened the door to the room where she said she performed her sittings. The first thing John noticed was the crystal ball sitting in the center of a round table in the middle of the room. Except for 6 chairs, this was the only furniture in the room. John suddenly felt stupid for the unease he had felt as he had entered the house. She was a crank, after all. "Look, Mrs. Joy, I don't think this is really a good idea," John stammered, backing towards the door. "There's no need to be nervous, and it's Miss Joy, although I would rather you called me Maddie. There's no need for us to be formal, is there?" The soft words stopped John's retreat. "After all, we seem to be from the same era." Her radiant smile enchanted John. Had she read his mind? Well, crank or no crank, he thought, it would be worth going through with this mumbo-jumbo, she proposed, just to spend a bit more time with her. The two of them sat at the table, opposite each other. Mitch was ordered to stand in the corner and say nothing. She spoke to him in a tone as though he were a naughty schoolboy, and Mitch complied, but was clearly sulking. To John's relief, she said she didn't need the crystal ball and moved it to one side. The curtains were closed, and the room was in semi-darkness, but John could see quite clearly. She stretched her arms across the table and told him to join hands. "Now just close your eyes and relax," she advised. John did this willingly, feeling the warmth flowing from her hands. He started to become lightheaded, opened his eyes, and stared at the woman opposite. She was murmuring under her breath and had her head tilted right back. John thought, if this is love, Then I will take it any day. Suddenly he felt her hands jerk, felt his flesh rip when her long fingernails broke the skin as her hold tightened. The murmuring had become loud and agitated. John turned to Mitch for help, but Mitch just shrugged. He turned back to find the hazel eyes boring into him. Only they weren't hazel, and the face wasn't that of Maddie. He was staring at the face of the child in his dreams. She seemed to be trying to say something, but John heard nothing. He tried to pull his hands free, but couldn't escape the vice-like grip. As he stared at the girl's face, it changed. He now saw Cindy, but as fast as she appeared, she was gone. And now he looked at the unwelcome features of the dead rat. If he hadn't known better, he would have sworn he heard it laugh. Then the rat was gone. He was now staring into the face of the prostitute whom he had hired to set up his last case. It was his last case, and he was fired. Then the face of the girl he knew as Sandra. The girl from his dreams was back, and this time he heard a small, weak voice beg for help. Then suddenly, Maddie was back, and she looked terrified, and there were tears streaming down her cheeks. John wanted to reach out and brush them aside, but he still couldn't move his hands. She suddenly screamed a blood-chilling shriek, and her head bounced back, and then forwards again, as though it was on a spring. And now, he was staring into the black hell-hole eyes of his father. The big face cracked open, and a foul stench filled the room. "Come and stop me, boy," the dead voice rattled. John let out a hollow sound and ripped his hands free. And Maddie was back. She gave vent to a low, rasping groan. Then her head fell sharply forward, hitting the tabletop with a sickening thud. Chapter 12. Maddie's head felt like lead. She tried to raise it from the table, but failed. She could hear concerned voices and tried again. This time she succeeded, but wasn't sure whether she could hold it up for long. The pain was screaming through her skull, and it felt as though it was coming from somewhere deep within inside her. Her head had hit the table hard, but she had suffered worse blows without so much pain. "I'm fine," she lied. "Are you sure? You've had a nasty knock." Maddie noticed the strange way that John was looking at her, and wondered if it was just the blow on the head he was worried about or something else. "It's a little sore, but I'll live," she assured him. "What made you act that way? What did you see?" Mitch stammered, his words falling over each other in their rush to be free. I don't know. I can't remember a thing," she answered slowly, watching John's face for any clues as to whether he knew anything. John remained stony-faced. "And what was that you said? Come and stop me, boy?" Mitch urged. "Yes, I can remember saying that, but I don't know why," Maddie mumbled, more to herself than to the two worried onlookers. "I know why," John said in a toneless whisper. Both faces turned towards him expectantly. "It was him. It was my father." "Your dead father?" Mitch queried. "Yes, I'm sure now that he really is dead, and for some reason he wants me." He sank back down in his seat heavily. "So I guess you won't be able to help me," John spat out in an "I told you so" manner. Maddie stared at him for a moment, and then offered a weak smile. "I wouldn't give up just yet." "You're not going to look in your crystal ball now, are you?" "Well, I know you're the #1 fan of the occult, and you have every faith in me, but no." "I'm sorry, I know I'm being sarcastic, but I guess I was hoping for a bit too much," he apologized. "No, that's okay." Maddie gestured with one hand. "I'm used to this reaction. People are willing to believe, so long as they hear what they want to hear." She was right, and John suddenly felt rather guilty. he would have embraced the whole situation, so long as it gave him a whole lot of answers and left everything nice and tidy, case closed. But things never work out that easy, and it was stupid of him to expect any different. "So what do you mean by not giving up yet?" he asked, in a pleasanter fashion. "Well, this has happened a couple of times before. It's not common, but it has been the K that, after I come out of my trance, I can't remember a thing. On both of the other occasions, however, I have remembered later." John felt hope surge through him. Up till now, he was the only one who had seen the changes in Maddie. They had all heard the voice, but it was only he who had witnessed the eerie images that had occurred. "So when do you think you will remember?" he urged. "It's hard to say." Maddie seemed to shrink into her seat. "The first time it took a couple of days to come to me, but on the last occasion it was over 6 weeks. John felt his heart sink like a stone. So this time, it could take even longer, if she remembered anything at all. The darkness of night had taken hold while they had been inside the house. It was a clear sky, and the far-off stars winked at John as he almost stumbled through the front door. "Steady now," they mocked. Although there had been no heating on in the room, he had still managed to break out into a sweat. But it was a cold sweat, a sensation that had every nerve in his body tingling. The cold breeze lapped round his ears, so he released the elastic band that held his hair in a ponytail and shook his head, sending locks of hair flying in all directions. Whether or not it did any good was a matter for speculation, but he felt better nonetheless. Ice had already formed on the car, and it took a bit of fumbling and cursing before Mitch was able to get the key into the lock and open the door. John quickly leapt inside and watched as Mitch went to work on the windows with a small yellow plastic scraper. "December the 1st tomorrow," John mused. "Maybe we'll have a white Christmas this year. Yay, and maybe I'll be visited by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. That's if I've got any bloody future." Floods of self-pity washed over him completely, and although he realized that he was sinking into self-despair, he didn't know why. He glanced out of the window at the ordinary-looking semi and tried to make sense of what had taken place. "You ready to go home?" Mitch chirped, jumping in behind the wheel. "Or would you prefer a nightcap somewhere?" "Just get me bloody home," John snapped. Okay. Mitch mumbled something else, but John didn't catch it over the noise of the engine firing up. John bit down hard on his lip, and a warm, coppery taste filled his mouth. Why had he snapped at Mitch? What the hell had he done? Apart from not starting the bloody car before his little ice scrapping. "Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bite your head off. It's just that I really do feel tired, and I don't think a beer is the best thing for me now." "No sweat. It is late, and we will need an early start in the morning." John was puzzled. "Why? What's happening in the morning?" "Well, if you're not doing anything better, I thought we might follow Roy and see what his typical day is. But I might have a job, or—" John let his sentence trail off. He had no illusions that any job had come in. Even if there had, he wouldn't be able to take it on and give it 100%. Not while this nightmare still hung above his head. "Okay," he submitted, "but haven't you got anything that you need to do?" "I'll just call the boss and tell him I'm working on something secret, and I'll let him know what later." "Will he buy it?" "Nope." Mitch grinned. John had a restless night. Although he didn't suffer any nightmares as such, he still had images floating in and out of his head all night. By 5 o'clock, he had had enough. It seemed as though every time he closed his eyes, another face appeared to torment him. Finally, he gave up and threw on his discarded clothes and went downstairs to await Mitch's arrival. He didn't have long to wait. No sooner had he reached the front room than there was a heavy knocking on the door. "Bloody hell," muttered John. When he said early, he bloody meant early. "Sorry to wake you at this hour," Mitch began, then eyed John up and down. "Or not wake you up, but I thought we should start as soon as possible." John could see that there was something on his mind, and by the look of him, he too hadn't had much sleep, but he decided against asking him any questions. "So, when do you want to set off now?" "Well, seeing as we are both up, it's as good a time as any." Mitch was trying to sound cheerful, but failing. "Okay then, but I doubt if Roy's up at this hour." "That's even better. We can catch him as he leaves, and he won't have a clue he's being followed." Mitch smirked. "So we'll take my car, and you can tell me where he lives on the way." A silence filled the room, and Mitch eyed John warily. "You do know where he lives?" John looked down at his feet uneasily. "Well, no. I supposed you did," he said weakly. He hadn't given it another thought. It had only just struck him now, but even as a lad, he could not recall ever going to Roy's house, and he sure had a lot more on his mind since returning than wondering where Roy lived. But he felt stupid just the same, and the way that Mitch was looking at him didn't improve matters. "Okay, so what now?" "Well, I don't know about you," Mitch said, sidling past into the front room and slumping down in the nearest chair, "but I could murder a brew." John sighed and went obediently into the kitchen. "But what if he isn't working today?" he shouted over his shoulder, splashing water everywhere but into the kettle. "There's only one way of finding out." The answer came, accompanied by the sound of the phone being dialed. "Hello, could you tell me if Roy Jones is on duty, please?" John couldn't hear the reply, but from the conversation that followed, he gathered that he would be on duty at 7:30, which gave them plenty of time to kill. And maybe they could come up with a better plan of attack than to just follow Roy. But after a lot of ideas thrown around the room, they realized that following him was about the only scheme they could dream up at the moment. By 7, they were waiting in the car behind the council offices opposite the police parking area. "So what car has he got?" Mitch didn't wait for an answer. The sheepish look that spread across John's face said it all. "Well, don't blame me," John protested. "He's only ever come round in his bloody cop vehicle." Okay. No panic. Just watch out for every motor that comes in." They didn't have long to wait. The third car to roll into the parking lot was Roy's. They nearly missed him getting out. They were both engrossed by the gleaming Triumph Herald soft top that looked as though it had just rolled off the production line, and he was nearly through the back door of the station when John caught sight of him. Mitch nodded as John pointed. Neither of them spoke. It was as though they expected the slightest sound to alert Roy to their presence. A half-hour passed slowly before Roy came out of the rear door and half wobbled, half strutted over to a patrol vehicle, wedged himself behind the wheel, and slowly pulled out, looking in just about every direction. John and Mitch as one slid down into their seats. If they hadn't known better, they would have sworn that Roy had been looking for them. But he had no way of knowing he was being followed, had he? John felt the familiar tingle of excitement crawl down his back. It was the feeling he always got when following someone, and to him, it was more like a game than a job. Will they catch me out, or won't they? Mitch fired the engine up and moved off, giving Roy enough time to turn onto the main road before following. There were 4 cars between them and him. "Don't get too far back," John whispered. "We don't want to lose him." "I have done this before, you know," snapped Mitch, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. I bet you have, John thought, following some poor bloke to get as much dirt on him as you can. Not much different from you, Johnny boy, a voice chirped in his head. You needn't whisper, Mitch added. He can't hear us, you know. I bloody know that. It's just that I usually work alone, huffed John, anger rising in his voice. Mitch gave him a sidewards glance and smiled. Let him stew, he decided. John caught the smile and was about to let fly when he realized what he must sound like. A broad grin flashed across his face, and then the grin turned to laughter. Mitch tried not to copy, but the laugh was infectious, and very soon the whole car was filled with the sound of their mirth. They followed Roy from one end of town to the other, from one village to another, down dirt tracks, country lanes, and even to the local Asda, where he spent a good hour doing his shopping. But he didn't do anything out of the ordinary, not that is, from what they could see. They were both getting a bit irritable and were starting to snap at each other again. What do you suggest? Give up, John hissed. No, but we could do a little research somewhere else and come back later and wait at the station for him to pick up his car. Although the idea was good and it appealed to John, if they did what Mitch was suggesting, they would just be defeating the object. Do what research? I don't know. Go to the library and see if we can dig anything else up. But Mitch didn't have much idea of what he meant. And supposing he does something while we are gone? Mitch knew that this was possible and admitted defeat. When he had said he had followed people before, he wasn't lying. But what he hadn't confessed was that he had hated every minute. He was not known for his patience. For the next 2 hours, they hardly spoke a word to each other, and Roy still didn't do anything out of the ordinary. A flood of relief swept through both of them when they realized that Roy was heading back to the station. After half an hour, Roy emerged from the rear door and made his way over to his car. Just as he was about to get in, a figure came out from the shadows of one of the garages. From their vantage point opposite, John and Mitch watched as the two men shook hands. Although the figure was small in stature, they could tell that it was a man. And from them way they shook hands. John guessed that they had only just met. After all, Roy didn't strike John as a man who shook hands with every friend at every encounter. Unless, of course, it was an old acquaintance that had just turned up out of the blue. But the way he seemed to be hiding in the shadows dismissed this idea. What do you think is going on there, then? Mitch asked, more to himself than his passenger. Beats me. After a couple of minutes, the man stepped back into the shadows, and Roy climbed into his car and started the engine. As he reversed and swung the car around, the headlights illuminated the figure in the shadows. It was only a brief moment, but long enough for John to see the man's face. A face he knew. What the fuck? He exclaimed. What's the matter? That man, I know him. Yeah, so... Mitch couldn't understand what was bugging John. It's only bloody Jason Mallory. The name meant nothing to Mitch. My boss's son, my ex-boss, the little shit who sacked me. Now Mitch could see why John was upset, but still couldn't grasp what the big deal was. My ex-boss, urged John. What the hell is he doing here? He probably hasn't even heard of Buckley, and what the hell is he doing talking to Roy? It is a mystery, Mitch agreed, but one we will have to figure out later. Let's go. Mitch eased out after Roy, not so far behind him this time. It was now dark, and they were less likely to be spotted. At least, that's what they hoped. John, still reeling from the shock of seeing wimpy Jason, didn't really notice where they were going. It was the bumpy road that brought him back to the present. He realized that they were no longer on the main road, but on an old dirt track. Mitch had dropped right back. He could just see the tail lights now and then, before they disappeared round the next bend. As they rounded yet another bend, Mitch nearly went right up Roy's arse end. He had stopped and was opening an old farm gate to a side lane. John slumped down in his seat as they drove past. As soon as they were out of sight, Mitch pulled over. "So what now?" "We'll leave the car and follow on foot," Mitch decided. "He might live miles down that lane," John argued. "But then again, he might not, and a car driving down his path would be a dead giveaway." As it turned out, Mitch was right. After a slight curve in the lane, an old farmhouse loomed into view. John tapped Mitch on the shoulder and pointed to an old barn that could just be glimpsed sticking out from behind the house. "Let's take a look in there," he suggested. The place looked derelict, but secure. Just as they reached the east side, a shrill scream ripped through the night. "You take that side, I'll go this way," hissed Mitch, taking off at a trot. As Mitch turned the corner, he ran straight into a brick wall and was knocked flat on his back. Shaking his head, he looked up to see the brick wall, but it was really a brick fist. And the fist's owner was an angry-looking Roy. Chapter 13. John rounded the corner just in time to see Roy place a well-aimed kick at Mitch's prone figure. "Stop!" yelled John, not breaking his stride. "There's no need to bloody kick him." Roy's foot stopped in mid-flight, and he jerked his head round to stare at John as he approached. What John saw in Roy's eyes stopped him in his tracks. They seemed to be a blazing blood-red color, and there was no sign of any recognition in them. Saliva was dripping from the snarling mouth, and his breath, in the cold night air, gave him the look of a flame-breathing beast rather than a human being. "Take it easy, Roy," John yelled, holding his hands out in front of him to ward off any danger. "Just take it easy." Mitch scrambled away and slowly eased himself to his feet with the help of the barn wall. Roy cast a hunted glance from side to side, from John to Mitch, as if he was a cornered animal deciding which one of them to attack first. As John braced himself for the encounter, an ice-cold sensation rippled through his body and slammed into his skull. The pain that followed quickly passed, and the cold feeling vanished. As he watched, the red lights in Roy's eyes flickered and went out. "John?" he gasped, as though seeing him for the first time. "What the hell are you doing here?" John began, but Roy wasn't listening. He was staring at the cowering form of Mitch, who was still pressed firmly against the barn wall. "Hey, look, I'm sorry," Roy offered his hand to shake. "I didn't recognize you in this light." "No problem," muttered Mitch, ignoring the outstretched hand. The moon was full, the sky was clear, and he sure as hell had no difficulty recognizing Roy. "Just what the hell are you doing here anyway?" Roy asked again, Mitch's reluctance to shake his hand not going unnoticed. John answered his question. "We came to see you, to find out if you have got any leads on the missing children." Roy eyed him suspiciously. John knew that it was a feeble reason to be there, but it was the first thing that came to mind. "Why didn't you come to see me in works time?" Roy prodded. "We did," John lied. "But you were out patrolling somewhere." "How did you find out where I live?" "We asked at the station." Roy stared hard at him, and he flinched under the intense scrutiny. After a long silence, Roy released John from his gaze and shook his head. Whether or not he believed the excuse, he wasn't saying. "I've got no further on this case than I told you last time." Roy sighed heavily, a sigh that reminded John of a second-rate actor overdoing his part. And it still goes that you don't print anything until I say. He spat vehemently at Mitch. Mitch recoiled under the harsh words. I won't print a word until you give permission. Good, snarled Roy, not taking his eyes off him for a moment. I would ask you in, but I'm busy. You know the way out. He had dismissed them as though they were nothing more than a couple of low lives from the gutter, and had started walking back towards the house when John's words brought him to a halt. We heard a child scream. John could see the muscles in the huge neck pulsate, and the wide shoulders flinched, as though he had been struck by a flying blade. The barn's old, a lot of timber's missing, he said, without turning, his words carrying easily in the still night. The wind makes some strange noises when it blows through them. John watched as the big man propelled himself towards the house at a speed that would have made a younger man green with envy. Let's get the hell out of here, commanded Mitch, disengaging himself from his wooded support. John could tell by the slight tremor in his voice that Mitch had no desire to push matters any further, so he turned and trotted after the quickly departing figure. Once they were back at the car, Mitch seemed to ease off slightly. Now that is one madman, he gasped breathlessly. I know. Did you see his eyes? See them. They were the only things that kept my mind off the kicking he was giving me. At last, thought John, he wasn't seeing things. This time Mitch had seen them too, so it wasn't a trick of the light. He heaved a sigh of relief. He no longer felt so much alone, and Mitch was becoming aware of the strange things that were happening too. So what about the scream we heard? Well, it could be as he said, Mitch offered weakly. Come off it, John snapped. There hasn't been a fucking wind all night. Mitch could see the anger rising in John and knew that he was right. Okay, say it was a scream. What are we going to do? We are going to have to go back. Hold on a minute. Alarm grew in Mitch's voice. Can't we just go and report it? Oh, yay. That would look real good, John spat sarcastically. Well, officer, we were prowling around an old barn and we heard a scream. When we confronted the owner, a police officer, he said it was just the wind. Okay, you've made your point, so we go back, Mitch submitted, turning to retrace his steps. Hold on there, buddy, John said, grabbing hold of his arm to hold him back. I know that if it was a scream, then the kid is in danger, but we are going to have to find another way in. We don't want to run into Roy again, do we? Do you really think he's got someone up there? I'm sure of it. Deep down, I know that was a scream we heard, and I'll bet my life that we're going to hear about another missing child. Mitch suddenly felt guilty over his reluctance to act. Well, let's find another way in. We've got no time to lose. It had taken those over 20 minutes to circle round the field and come up at the rear of the barn. A few clouds had appeared in the sky, blocking out the moon's light and offering them shadows to hide in. Someone's watching over us, John whispered. Well, let's hope he calls a warning if Roy comes this time, Mitch mumbled, rubbing his bruised ribs. They were concealed behind a thorn hedge, and as they looked, there didn't seem to be any way of getting into Roy's land without having to climb over it. And although it was winter, its branches still held some nasty weapons. They edged their way along the hedge until they came upon a low section that wasn't as dense as the rest of it. This is as good a place as any, John whispered, turning to Mitch. But Mitch wasn't there. He had taken 10 paces back and was now running towards the hedge. John watched in awe as the reporter vaulted easily over the hedge and landed on his feet, as though he was competing in the Highland Games. John took 10 paces back, and then thinking better of it, took another 5. He stampeded towards the hedge and threw his body as high into the air as he could. But even as he took off, he knew that he had jumped too soon. His foot was grabbed by what felt like 100 talons, and he fell head first onto the ground. Although it was grass on the other side, the cold winter night had turned the ground into concrete, and as he hit it, his nose exploded and white bolts of lightning flashed through his skull. Mitch scrambled over and worked on the spikes that held John's foot. The pain in his nose easily outweighed the pain of the thorns that had ripped into his ankle, and the blood was now flowing freely. John cursed himself for putting on training shoes instead of his trusty cowboy boots that he usually wore. "Are you okay?" Mitch asked, staring down at the sorry-looking features of his friend. "I'll live," replied John, wiping blood from his face with his sleeve. "Let's go." The frost-covered grass snapped under every step, sounding like firecrackers exploding in the still night. John tried to put as little weight as possible on each foot as he trotted towards the barn. There was just as much noise, but it did bring a smile to Mitch's face. On reaching the barn, they threw themselves against the wall, trying hard to blend in with the rough wooden panels. Edging their way along, they soon came upon the tall doors, and around the doors hung a thick, heavy chain with the biggest padlock John had ever seen. "What about a window?" whispered Mitch. John looked up the tall walls. Nothing. He couldn't remember seeing any in the other walls either. "There aren't any. It looks as though this is the only way in." Mitch fell down to his knees and started to prise a section of the door away, sending a loud creaking noise echoing through the air. "Shh," John hissed, cringing. There was another loud crack, and then a piece of the rotten paneling came away from the steel frame. "I could probably manage to get my leg through it at a push." "Okay, I'm working on it. Just one more board and we can get in," Mitch snapped. "Yeah, and if you carry on making all that noise, then Roy will be working on us." Another loud snapping sound reverberated through the night as Mitch fell backwards, clutching his prize of another section of rotten door. John pushed himself through the opening and waited while his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Rays of moonlight filtered through the holes in the roof, illuminating the ground with hundreds of small spotlights. It was in one of these small spotlights that John could see a crude, wooden bench on the far side of the barn. As he got closer, he could make out rusty chains bolted to a steel beam, and on the end of the chains were manacles. Small manacles, too small to fit an adult wrist. Bile filled his mouth, and he spat it out with disgust. "So it is him!" Mitch snarled, edging behind John and his gruesome discovery. "Look," gasped John, lifting one of the manacles. "Blood! So we did hear a scream." "Let's get into that house and beat it out of him," Mitch hissed, running for the door. "Hold on, we still haven't got any real evidence," John yelled, racing after him, and we did break in. Mitch didn't let up speed as he ran to the house and lunged at the back door. The wood splintered as the door was dragged from the frame, and both the door and Mitch went sprawling across the tiled kitchen floor. "Well done, Rambo," mocked John, stepping over the sprawling Mitch. He wrinkled his nose as the smell of damp and decay greeted him. It smelt just the same as Kukulkan did the first time he entered that, but his house had an excuse. It hadn't been lived in for a while. Mitch staggered to his feet, clutching his shoulder. "Next time you can be Rambo." "Well, I guess he isn't in." "What makes you so sure?" asked Mitch. "I'm sure because you made enough noise to raise Count Dracula from his beauty sleep," snapped John, raising his voice to prove his point. "He might be a heavy sleeper, And besides, Count Dracula doesn't sleep at night. He only sleeps in... John was about to snap back when he saw the slight curve on Mitch's lips. Your sense of humor is a bit thin at times. Yeah, it has been said. Let's look around. He might have brought the kid in here. But although he said it, Mitch didn't believe it. After a quick look round the house, they hadn't found anything. Well, they had discovered one thing, and that was Roy lived like a pig. The smell of mold was in every room, and the wet wallpaper hung in tatters from practically every wall. There was almost no furniture in the house, and his bed was just an old mattress tossed in one corner of a room. How can he live like this, yet his car looks gleaming and new, even if it is over 30 years old? Gasped Mitch. Beats me, John said, shaking his head. It's as though he just doesn't care about how he lives, and he sure as hell isn't into the luxuries of life. He can only be 20 minutes ahead of us at most, but without knowing where he is going, it might as well be 20 days, sighed Mitch, defeated. I might know where he's heading, John shot back, making for the door. Mitch was hot on his heels. He was glad to get out of the pigsty. So where? He shouted after the quickly vanishing figure. This time they weren't hiding in the shadows. They were running straight up the main drive. The field! The words came floating back to Mitch and hit him like a hammer. Of course, the field. So much had happened at the field that it seemed the only place he would be going. At least they hoped it was, and that they arrived in time for his victim's sake. John jumped in behind the wheel of the car. Mitch didn't object. He just handed over the keys and climbed in beside him. The drive to the field could have beaten the land speed record, and Mitch was relieved when they turned onto the lane, forcing John to slow down. As they approached the gate, they were suddenly blinded by cars, headlights that were glaring on full beam. John pulled as far over to the side as he could, avert his eyes, but still seeing wallow flashes. Mitch swung round in his seat and caught sight of the distinctive shape of the Triumph Herald's rear lights. It was Roy, he yelled. Should we follow him? No, John said, quickly making his mind up. He came up to the field for a purpose. He glided the car up to the gate, almost leaving no room to open the door, and was out of the vehicle and over the gate in one swift movement. As he flew over the gate, his entire body was raked by a sensation similar to having 1,000 volts shot through him. He hit the other side on his face, setting off another flow of blood from his bruised nose. He shook his head to clear his eyes of the fog, but soon realized that the mist was swirling all around the field, and he could see dark shapes dancing about like he had the last time. But this time, nothing came to greet him. There was thud to his left, and Mitch was kneeling beside him. He had no problem landing on his feet, thought John. Can you see anything? Mitch inquired, pointing into the mist. What? You mean those dancing shapes? John said, hoping that they were what Mitch meant. What dancing shapes? Asked Mitch, puzzled. I mean over there, by the trees. Trees? What bloody trees? All John could see was the bloody mist, a mist that it seemed only he could see. Let's get over there, he suggested, slapping Mitch on the back. You lead the way. Mitch set off at a run without looking back, and it took all of John's energy to keep up. If he let him get too far ahead, he would lose him in the fog. Suddenly, Mitch stopped dead, and John went flying into him, almost sending them both sprawling. What's the matter? John hissed. There's the kid, but something feels wrong. John strained his eyes and could just make out the form of a child sitting on the ground, and from what he could make out, he seemed to be tied to a post. He or she. They moved slowly towards the immobile form, and when it seemed as though nothing was going to happen, Mitch sprinted the rest of the way. Testing the boy's pulse, he sighed with relief. He's still alive. John sank to his knees and helped to untie the ropes that were binding the child. We're going to have to get him to hospital quick. The mist and figures seemed to be getting thicker, and John felt as though he was drowning. Hurry, Mitch, he urged. You don't think that he's coming back? Mitch breathed. And why the hell did he leave him out here in the open? His question was answered by a loud, angry beast-like scream from within the trees. John jumped to his feet, but Mitch didn't seem to have heard it. Come on! We've got to get out of here, yelled John. Mitch was startled by his sudden reaction. What the hell's the matter? Just believe me. If we don't move quick, then we're going to be in deep shit. Mitch realized that John was in deadly earnest and quickly scooped up the limp body and set off at a run towards the gate. John looked behind in time to see a huge figure covered in tatters of animal skins burst from the trees. The noise it was making would have frozen the fires of hell, and John could feel his strength ebbing away. It was as though the creature had an invisible line connected to his back, and for every step he took, the beast was pulling him back one. He could hear Mitch's voice floating through the mist. John, why have you stopped? Just get the kid out of here! John screamed, cursing Mitch for not being able to see the danger that he was in. But there was one thing. If Mitch couldn't see it, then maybe it couldn't hurt him. But he didn't want to take any chances. Just get the hell out of here, he yelled again. Mitch didn't need any more telling, and set off at a run, once more muttering, just what the hell's got into him? John could almost feel the snorting beast's breath on his neck when the hold suddenly let go, and he propelled forwards as though he had just taken the full force of a bomb explosion. He almost fell to his knees, but was able to just about keep himself upright by running along on all fours. He could hear the heavy footsteps behind, but wasn't taking any chances. He knew that if he stole a glance back, then it would be the end for him. A sudden spurt of energy washed through him. It was almost sexual, as he felt his tired body take on a new lease of life. He felt fitter than he ever had, and his strides doubled, and the mist seemed to part out of his way, giving him a clear view of the gate a couple of 100 yards ahead. He was pounding towards the gate like an Olympic athlete. He felt more confident than he ever had since returning, and took the risk of looking back. A big mistake. The beast was right behind him. He stretched out his claw-like hand and gripped John's shoulder, sending pain down his entire side. Breaking loose of the hold, John pushed forwards, but lost his footing and crashed into the old wooden gate. He managed to climb a couple of the gate beams when a hand shot round his neck. A voice close to his ear sent a pain through his head. Come to Daddy boy, then we're complete. It rattled. He felt his grip on the gate weaken and was about to fall back into the field when something pulled him forwards. The sudden change in movement sent his head against the gate, which it struck with a sickening thud, and the voice that had invaded his head suddenly disappeared, and instead of having a pain from the blow against the gate, the pain left his head also, and he was left with a feeling of utter relaxation, and he no longer cared about falling back into the field. He just felt as though he could float, and he floated off into darkness. Chapter 14. Hey, hold on there, Mitch yelled, pulling John over the gate by his collar. There isn't anyone after you. You're okay. John no longer felt as if he was floating. Now he felt to be flying, and over the gate he flew. As soon as he was on the other side, his head started throbbing. What hit me? He asked, passing a hand lightly over his bruised head. Nothing hit you, Mitch replied, puzzled. You head-butted that bloody gate as though it wasn't there. John smiled weakly. What the hell got into you anyway? There was no one out there. There was no one following us. I swear that I will tell you everything, John promised. But not just now. Okay, sighed Mitch. At the moment we've got better things to do. Like getting this poor kid to a hospital. No hospital, John objected. Look, he needs help right now. I know. But it might not be safe to take him to a hospital. It could be a trap. Roy might be dogging our every move. After a moment's pause, Mitch agreed. What do you suggest? Maddie, John said meekly. Hold on there. Mitch tried to find his words. You've only just met her, and I don't really know her much better. So what the hell makes you think she would agree? And there's the danger we would be putting her in. John had thought of the danger, and although he didn't like it, it was one of the few options they had. If she said no and refused to help, he would understand. But he felt certain that that would not be her response. Although he had only just met her, he felt that he knew her, really knew her, as if there was an unspoken bond between them. Or was it wishful thinking? She had certainly stirred something in him, and he decided that when all this shit was over, he would try to get to know her better. He was suddenly aware of Mitch glaring at him. Well, what makes you so sure that she will help? He asked again. John just shrugged lamely and offered a weak smile, indicating that the debate was over. Maddie opened the door and was shocked to see her visitors. It wasn't the hour, after all. It was only just gone 8. She regarded the lifeless bundle of rags that Mitch was holding as though it was an offering. A bunch of flowers or a box of chocolates would have done, she thought. But then she realized that the bundle of rags was a child, and concern took over. What happened? She queried, pulling back a corner of the dirty blanket in which the child was wrapped. Not waiting for an answer, she ushered them in and ordered Mitch to take the child upstairs and put him in her bed. Turning to John, she observed, At a guess, this has something to do with you. John turned crimson and was lost for words. She smiled at his unease. Okay, tell me about it. As Mitch came back down the stairs, John wondered how much he should tell her. Everything? He saw the look on Mitch's face when he got to the part about his client and the job she had hired him to do, and about the strange dreams. John just smiled at him, apologetically, and hoped he would not feel too bad at not having been told the whole story. When he had finished, he studied Maddie's face for any reaction. He could read nothing in her expression. You've had a hell of a lot of bad memories bottled up inside you, she finally remarked. It's no wonder that you keep getting these nightmares. But the nightmares have only started since I came back, John pointed out. The house, the field, finding the old nameplate. They are all things that help to trigger off these dreams, to start your imagination off. Well, that bloody child upstairs isn't any imagination, he yelled. And the fact that as soon as I visited old Woods he ends up dead isn't my imagination, and I'm sorry. I'm not trying to say that you have dreamt all this up. It's just that I think you are open to suggestions. Meaning what? Well, like I said on your last visit, certain things come back to me. John sat bolt upright, eager to hear what was coming next. So you have got an idea why all this is happening? He urged. It would be a lie if I said I knew what was happening, but I do have an idea. Anything's better than nothing. Did you have a sister who died? John was puzzled by the question. No, why do you ask? What about a female relation who died? Well, of course, my mother, my aunt. No, I mean a young relation, say 7 or 8. John felt his guts tighten. No. Now what the hell is this all about? He demanded. If you're sure, then I guess I'm wrong, Maddie conceded. But I keep getting this impression that someone close to you, who has departed, is behind all your nightmares. John's heart sank. So if he was going to get any answers, they weren't going to come from Maddie. But he guessed that he had always known that. I know you have got your problems, Mitch interrupted, but we have got a dilemma upstairs at the moment. As though to prove his point, a moaning sound came echoing down the stairs. Maddie was the first to rush upstairs, Mitch and John lagging behind. Neither of them wanted to be the first to reach the child, as neither of them was quite sure just what to do or say. Although Maddie had no children, she knew just how to act round them. She murmured soothingly and gently rocked the boy until the moaning became a whimper, and then the whimper died away to a mere sniff. "What's your name?" she coaxed, but the child just clung to her and stared in horror at the 2 men in the room. "I think you're scaring him. It would be best if you waited downstairs. I might be able to get him to talk," she suggested. "Okay," they both said in unison, glad to let her deal with it, and jamming the doorway in their attempt to leave the room at the same time. Maddie smiled and shook her head. It was as though she had 3 children in the house, not just one. Half an hour later, they heard Maddie coming down the stairs again. Neither of them had spoken in that half hour. Now they were firing questions at her, left, right, and center. Hold on, she said, flinging up her hands, one at a time. "Did you find out anything?" John asked. "No, not really. All I could get out of him was the monster man. But as for who he is, or where he comes from, I drew a blank." "So he saw him too," John whispered. "Saw who?" asked Mitch. "The monster man. My father. Kukulkan, the asshole who chased us in the field. Only you never saw him." Mitch shrugged his shoulders. "I'm sorry." "It's not your fault," John assured him. "It's just that now I know that I'm not the only one who sees him. These poor kids see him as well." "Hold on a minute," Maddie butted in. "When he said monster man, he might have meant Roy." John thought about it for a brief moment, then dismissed it. "No, I'm sure he meant my father, and if he saw him, it's no wonder the kid is in such a bad state." "So what are we going to do now?" inquired Mitch. "Well, if it's okay with Maddie, we will leave him here tonight, and tomorrow try and find out if there's been any young boys reported missing." He smiled when Maddie nodded in agreement. As John pulled up to his house, he saw the Triumph Herald tucked in the slight lay-by by the gate. Turning off the engine, he sat for a moment studying the car. There was no sign of movement. Climbing out of his own vehicle, he slowly edged over to the Herald, looking all around as he closed the gap. Peering through the window, he could see the car was empty. He was just trying the door when a harsh voice froze his fingers. "I was wondering where you got to." John swung round and saw Roy's grisly frame lumbering towards him. "Oh, hi," John stammered. "I was just wondering whose car this is." "Oh yeah, you've never seen my car before, have you?" Roy sneered. "You've only been round in the police car," laid John, adding, "It's in good condition." "It's my pride and joy," Roy smiled. And then remembering what he was there for, his voice turned harsh once more. "But I thought you might have seen it when you were up at my house earlier." "No, it was dark. I didn't see much." No sooner had he said it than John felt like kicking himself. It was bloody dark now, and he saw it all right. "Well, I just called round to apologize for before. But you did turn up at my house unannounced." By the tone in his voice, John could tell that he wasn't sorry in the least. As soon as he entered the house, he could tell that someone had been in there. In fact, that Roy had been in there. It wasn't any little thing that led him to that conclusion. No book slightly moved, no little mark in the dust. No, he realized that someone had been in there because the place was like a bomb site. The television had been smashed. His new hi-fi had been slung across the room, and there was even a CD embedded in the door jamb. The whole place had been totally blitzed. "The bastard!" snarled John. He knew that Roy had done it, and he knew that Roy knew that he knew he had done it. Was it a warning? Or was it Roy's way of saying, "Look what I've done, and there's nothing you can do about it"? And John knew that he was right. There would be no bloody point in reporting it. After all, he would only end up with Roy investigating the case. It took nearly an hour to make the place look halfway livable in again, and at the end, John was done in, so he wearily dragged himself up to bed. The nightmares came again that night with a vengeance. John was lying in bed awake, or so he thought. He realized that he couldn't be awake when the bed opened up and swallowed him. He didn't feel he was falling so much as being dragged down, but down he went. It was like going down in slow motion. He watched as first the covers went by, then the mattress, springs and all, then the space beneath the bed. "I'll have to clean all that dust up. What a messy person I am," he thought. Then the floorboards flashed by, and he fell through the ceiling into the room below. As he plummeted down, the speed picked up, and he felt as if he really was crashing into the concrete below. His body felt like it had been kicked by a dozen mules as he was dragged through the floor and into the earth beneath. He could taste the mud as it filled his mouth, and just when he thought he was going to pass out, he fell through the earth and landed in a large cave. The cave was lit by torches on either side, lighting up strange drawings on the slimy walls. Gingerly, John climbed to his feet, and for the first time realized how vulnerable he was, standing in the damp cave in just his boxer shorts. Suddenly, he saw a light appear in the corner, and then it grew brighter. He noticed that there was an opening, and hearing footsteps, reckoned that it wouldn't be long before he met his host. The smell came first, filling every little notch in the cave, and then came death. Not death itself, but death in the form of his father. And just by looking at him, John no longer had any doubts whatsoever that he was indeed dead. "Well, hi there, son. So nice of you to drop in," Death rattled. "I'd offer you something, but I don't seem to have anything in at the moment." John stared at the pitiful sight in front of him. He no longer wore his snake skull and furs, and the bones on his arms and legs were his, and they were sticking rudely out of his rotting flesh. John half expected the creature to buckle at any moment, but the creature didn't buckle. "Oh, forgive my appearance," it gibbered, "but I don't seem to work out as much as I used to." The whole cave was filled with an inhuman cackle. John tried to speak, but couldn't. "What's the matter, son? Cat got your tongue." Suddenly, in the monster's hand, a cat appeared, a black cat. John couldn't be sure if it was his cat, but it sure as hell looked like it. As he watched in horror, Death thrust his hand down the cat's throat and pulled out its tongue. A scream that sounded like a little girl's echoed round the stinking cave. "Why don't you have this one?" Death mocked, throwing the cat's tongue at John. He tried to duck, but the wet piece of flesh hit him right in the mouth, filling it with a salty taste. "Now we can talk," his father said, closing the gap between them in 2 easy strides. John fell back, but the monster was on him, breathing foul fumes at him. Dragging him off the floor, he was thrust face to face with the decaying features of his dad. "Now, son, I think it's about time you joined me down here." It was too much for John's stomach, and he felt the bile rising in his throat and gush out into the putrid face of his father. The beast screamed and flung him to the other side of the cave in one swift movement. "I was going to make it easy for you," the ghoul spat at him, "but I've changed my mind." John heard a loud knocking and a familiar voice calling his name. "Don't worry, no one can save you now." But John didn't believe it. He focused all his attention on the voice and closed his eyes, shutting out the grotesque image in front of him. Suddenly, it was as though he was on the end of a bungee rope. He felt a jerk and was lifted off his feet, lifted the way he had come, leaving the wailing of the depraved creature below. He saw the room, the ceiling, the floor, and the mattress go by. And then he felt the hole in the bed close beneath him. He lay there for a moment, and then in a panic in case it opened up again, he threw himself out and as far away from the bed as possible. But the bed just looked like any other bed. The knocking and shouting down below was louder now, so flinging on his dressing gown, John stumbled downstairs. "Okay, don't smash the door down. I'm coming." "Hell, I thought something had happened to you," Mitch wheezed, out of breath from all the shouting. "Well, let's just say I wasn't altogether here," John commented. Mitch looked puzzled. "When you never called, and I couldn't get any answer, well, I thought something had happened to you." John smiled at his friend's obvious concern. "You can make a brew while I get ready," John said, looking at his watch. "I guess I'm running a little late." As he turned, something fell from his dressing gown. Mitch stooped to pick it up. "What's this?" he asked, holding a small pink object. John looked hard at the small piece of flesh. "That, my friend, is what is meant by the saying, 'Loose talk or tongues cost lives.'" Mitch stared at the article in his hand a moment, and then, realizing what the pink rubbery thing was, dropped it as though it was on fire. "What the hell's going on?" "I'll tell you on the way over to Maddie's," John promised. Half an hour later, they arrived at Maddie's and learnt that there was no further response from the boy. He was still saying nothing. John quickly described the events that had happened to him in his nightmare. "You sure as hell pissed him off," Maddie finally said. "It seems as though he really wanted the boy, and you got in the way of his plans." "I guess so. It looks as though Roy gets the kids and delivers them to my father, but what I can't understand is why. If we knew why, we would be halfway to beating them." John liked the sound of "we," but although they could help him with Roy, it looked as though his father was his problem with which he had to deal, and they wouldn't be much helps to him against whatever lay ahead. "We better start trying to find out who this little boy belongs to and put them out of their misery," Mitch butted in. "Yeah, you're right," John agreed. Turning to Maddie, he said, "We'll talk about this later." "I'm not going anywhere," she smiled. When they arrived at John's office, they found it in the same state his house had been in the night before. "Jesus!" exclaimed Mitch. "It sure looks as if Roy got pissed off when we saved that kid." "I guess it's pointless to try the answering machine," John said, picking up the broken instrument. "It might be best to go to my house, and I'll ring round from there and see what we can come up with," Mitch suggested, still staring at the room in disbelief. "Yeah, looks as though my welcome has run out here. So now that Roy thinks we saved the kid, what do you imagine he's going to do?" Mitch asked, after they had been driving a short while. "Well, for one thing, Roy doesn't think. He knows. And for what he's going to do now, your guess is as good as mine." You know, I've been thinking, Mitch mused, as though it had just come to him. What if Roy killed Henry Woods because he was scared that he would tell you something? The same thought had crossed John's mind 1,000 times. It's almost certain that he killed him, he hissed. Well, what I was thinking was, if he killed him, then what is there to stop him killing us? Before he could answer, he spotted someone walking along the pavement. Stop the car! Before the car had a chance to stop, John was out and had the surprised Jason Mallory by the throat and up against the wall. What are you doing here? He yelled. And what did you want with Roy Jones? Take it easy. I only came to collect my money, the sniffling boss's son yelped. Collect what money? The money he paid me for sacking you, Jason blurted out. John felt as though someone was about to jump out and tell him it was all a joke. Candid camera. Roy had paid to have him sacked. Why? Chapter 15. John looked hard at the man who was halfway responsible for him coming back to Buckley. He felt like hitting him right between the eyes, but he knew that Jason was just a pawn in the game. Get the hell out of my sight before I decide to rip your head off, John snarled, in a fake Hollywood accent. The ex-boss didn't notice the mockery in the voice. To him, it was real, and the man in front of him would indeed rip his head off. He didn't fancy the idea, so he took off down the street as if the devil himself was after him. What was all that about? Mitch asked, as John climbed back into the car. I know why he was in Buckley, John said reflectively. Roy had paid him to sack me. Sack you, echoed Mitch. But why? Why indeed? When I didn't take up the house straight away, he must have got worried. I don't understand, Mitch frowned, puzzled. Why on earth does he want you back in Buckley? That my friend is something we're going to find out, John promised. Yeah, Mitch said, starting the engine. But first we've got to deal with the boy. When they arrived at Mitch's house, John was impressed. He hadn't realized how much money there was to be made as a freelance reporter. This is some place, he whistled. I like it, but I don't know how long I'll be staying here. Mitch sighed John, then noticed the for sale sign and the tone in Mitch's voice and queried, then why sell it? Oh, if I had my way I wouldn't, but my wife, my ex-wife, has other ideas. John realized for the first time just how little he knew about his new friend. He had told his problems, but had never asked about Mitch's personal life. He suddenly felt embarrassed that he had acted as if, as far as he was concerned, Mitch was a reporter, and that was all he needed to know. I'm sorry. I didn't even know you were married, he muttered. I am still married. I'm the one divorcing her. And she took the kids and went off with a younger man. Then what claims can she have on the house? John asked in surprise. She's entitled to half. The law's on her side. Even though I worked every hour God sent for years so that we could afford the place, and regardless of, he spluttered, regardless of the fact that she has never had to work, I can't afford to buy her out, which means I have to sell. Noticing the bitterness on Match's face, John let the matter go. After about an hour of ringing round, Mitch found that within a 50-mile radius, 3 children had gone missing. What do you reckon? He asked John. Start with the closest, get a description, and we'll see where we go from there, John advised. Mitch rang the first name on the list and told the women on the other end of the line that he would put a piece in the paper and do all he could to help. He wasn't lying. The trembling voice on the other end was all he needed to make him realize that not enough was done to help these families, that they were just left alone to cope on their own with their losses. That's a blank, he said. Their boy's blonde. Ringing the next name on the list, however, brought a description that seemed to fit the lad that they had. Placing a hand over the mouthpiece, Mitch inquired, "What should I tell them?" "Nothing," John replied. "Just arrange a meeting." He listened as Mitch told the person on the line that he would like to interview them and that he would call on them at home in an hour and a half's time. "Let's hope it is their boy," John sighed. "At least then, there would be one happy ending." "What about this last name on the list? Should I ring them?" John thought for a moment. "No, we will leave it for now and see how this turns out," he decided finally. When they collected the child, John could see the obvious relief on Maddie's face. He knew that they had asked a lot of her, even put her in danger, but she hadn't uttered a word of complaint. When Mitch asked her to look after the boy, she had readily agreed, thought John. She knew the risk she was taking, but still agreed. And although she knew Mitch, he himself had only just met her, mocked her even, yet she was still willing to help. Looking at her, John could almost see the warmth radiating from her. "I'm sorry we put you in this tricky situation," he said sheepishly, and leaning forward, kissed her gently. Realizing what he had done, he cringed and waited for the outcome somewhat apprehensively, but she just smiled. "I would do it again if it helps these poor children, and if it helped you." She let the sentence trail. "Okay, you two, enough of this heart-to-heart. We've got a meeting to go to." Mitch butted in, lightheartedly. John blushed a deep red and followed Mitch and the zombie-like child to the car. But on reaching the 8, the boy pulled his hand free, ran back up the path, and lunged at Maddie. He held her tight, as though he was trying to stop her from floating into the clouds. "Come on, mate," Mitch urged. "I don't think he wants to come with us," grinned John. "I told you not to wear cheap aftershave." "I'll get my coat," Maddie said, leading the clinging boy inside. When they pulled up outside the Dentons' home, they could see the curtain moving and a pallid face peering out. Maddie, shielding the child from view, was watching him covertly for any sign of recognition of the street or area. His face remained blank. "Okay, Maddie," John said, leaning over the seat. "You wait here until we are certain that this is their boy or not." Before they had reached the door, it was flung open, and a white-faced woman, her eyes bloodshot with weeping, welcomed them as though they were her saviors. "Have you any news? Anything? Anything?" she pleaded. "We're not sure. Can we come in?" She stepped aside to let them pass. "Can I get you a drink?" she asked, absently. John could see that her mind was miles away and declined. When they entered the front room, they stopped in their tracks. It looked like a shrine. There were toys littered everywhere, and all over the floor were pictures of a baby's smiling face, and of the same face in different stages of growth. The woman didn't apologize for the mess. It seemed to them that she was too upset to see that there was a mess. They tried to skirt round the toys and pictures, but she just waded through them as though they weren't there. "Where's your husband?" Mitch asked. "I'm not married," she whispered. "I only have Dean." The tears started rolling down her hollow cheeks. "May I have a look at these photos?" John inquired, gently scooping up a handful. She seemed to notice them for the first time. "How did they get there?" she mumbled, distantly. John stared at one of the photos, and then turned it towards Mitch. The smiling face gazing back was the same as the sad one in the car. John watched as Mitch got up and left the room. The woman didn't seem to notice. She was staring at her hands, watching numbly as the tears rolled from her cheeks and splashed down on her fingers. Mitch re-entered the room with the boy who was still clinging on to Maddie. The woman had her back to the door, but as soon as they entered, she shot upright and spun around. "Dean, Dean!" she screamed. The words echoed round the room, and the zombie boy suddenly came to life. He let go of Maddie and ran over to his mother. "Mummy, Mummy!" the boy sobbed, and held on to her as he had with Maddie. "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you," the woman moaned, and the three rescuers felt tears not so far away. "We found him walking the streets," Mitch began, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. John placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "Not now," he whispered, and nodded towards the door. They slipped out of the room unnoticed, relieved to escape into the cold, fresh wind outside. "If only all these torments could end like that," Maddie sniffed. "So long as there are people like Roy around, they never will," John growled. "So what are we going to do about Roy?" Mitch asked. "We have got to stop him before he strikes again." "Maybe he won't strike again," Maddie observed, not really believing her own words. "She could be right," Mitch remarked. "He might know that we are on to him and be too scared to do it again." John shook his head. "No, he will have another go. I don't know how I know it, but I do." "So what are we going to do?" Mitch repeated. "We are going to make sure that the bastard knows that we are on to him," John declared after a moment's reflection. "But if he did take us seriously, then what is to stop him killing us on the spot?" Mitch argued. "We just tell him that if anything happens to us, then there is a letter with an editor just waiting to be published. Do you think that he will buy it, or even care?" John just shrugged, and both Maddie and Mitch felt an icy chill and shivered involuntarily. They went back to Maddie's to decide on a course of action and how to deal with Roy, but the main reason was to drop Maddie off. On the journey back, she had insisted on being there when they confronted Roy. "But Maddie," John argued, "if anything was to happen to us, you are the only one who knows the truth. Besides, he doesn't know you exist," added Mitch. Okay, you're right," she conceded, "but be careful." As Roy reached his front door and half turned the key, they pounced. They hit him with so much force that the door flew open, and the three of them tumbled inside, landing in an untidy heap on the floor. Roy thrashed about, trying to strike his attackers, but both his hands were pinned to the ground. "Now just stay still, you bastard, or I'll do you so much damage that you will wish you was dead," Mitch hissed in a low, menacing voice. Roy tried to move, but was pushed deeper into the floor. As his vision cleared, he spied one of his assailants. "John," he gasped, "what the hell is going on?" "You may well ask, you asshole, but we know what you have been up to." Roy let out a hollow laugh. "Oh, you do you, boy?" The laugh sounded demonic and unnerving, so John drove his knee into the lawman's ribs to cut it short. Roy growled, "Now that's not nice, is it? And it's not nice what you have been doing to these poor kids, you evil bastard," Mitch spat out. "Ah, Mr. Reporter, I hope you haven't printed anything yet," sneered Roy. "Not yet, but I will, just before you get what you deserve." "Oh, I'll get what I deserve, but it won't be by your hands." "Well, Roy," growled John, "we have spoilt your little game. The boy's still alive." Another laugh filled the hallway. "Yeah, I know that, but you see, I had another one as backup." His words struck the two men like a rock. As soon as they had found out those 3 children had gone missing, why hadn't they suspected this? "You son of a bitch," yelled John, ramming another knee into the big man's ribs. "Why are you doing it?" "You wouldn't understand," snarled Roy, through clenched teeth. "Try me." I know that you are delivering them to my father. Oh, your father is it, you sad boy. You know nothing. His tone was scornful. Suddenly, John understood what was in Roy's words. We've got to get up to the field, now, he gasped. Oh, you better run, boy. There is no time to waste, grinned Roy. What about him? Mitch queried. We will have to make sure that this sack of shit doesn't go anywhere. Oh, John, such cruel words. The cop gave a mocking laugh. They dragged Roy over to the banister and secured him to the stairs with his own handcuffs. A quick inspection of his pockets produced the key. John kicked him between the legs for good measure, and the big man let out a piercing scream. John quickly put the key into the open mouth and held Roy's nose, pulling his head back. He tickled his throat like he had seen on a vet program once. Roy choked a couple of times and then swallowed hard. John pulled his mouth open and smiled when he saw that the key had gone. You had better pray that we are in time, he yelled at the bloated man, dangling from the stairs. Mitch zoomed along like a racing driver, and they soon arrived at the field. Taking a deep breath, John lunged over the gate. As he hit the ground on the other side, he braced himself for the sick and dizzy feeling, but the sick and dizzy sensation didn't come. He felt nothing but the racing of his heart. There was a thud, and Mitch landed by his side. What's the matter, buddy? He asked. Nothing. I was just a bit winded, John lied. Where do we look? Mitch queried. How about the same spot as last time? They set off at a rapid pace until they reached the area, and both slowed down as one. There was nothing there. They had been stupid to expect that there would be. Nothing, Mitch gasped. So where do we look now? I don't know. I have as much idea as you. Then something caught John's eye. Over there, he pointed. Mitch followed the direction of his arm, but saw nothing. What am I supposed to be looking at? He demanded. The ground has been disturbed. Then Mitch spotted it, about 20 yards from where they had discovered Dean Denton. There was a patch of freshly dug earth. He felt his heart sink as he realized that they were too late. John was down on his knees, digging furiously at the frozen ground. Let's call the police, Mitch urged. No, we have got to make sure. Maybe it's a trick, and that's what Roy wants us to do. How would we look then? But it was no trick. A small white hand soon came into view, and in the hand was a little green plastic dagger. The boy must have been playing when he was snatched, and had clung on to the knife as if for protection. But it gave no protection. As John uncovered more, and the face was exposed, Mitch swallowed hard as the truth hit him. It's the first house I rang, he groaned. The blonde-haired boy. Are you sure? I'm not sure. Yet I am. John nodded his understanding. Just then, a piece of paper came away with the next clod of earth. John unfolded it and swore loudly. What is it? Mitch asked, snatching at the scrap of paper. The words were in red ink and read, Hard luck, son. I'll be seeing you soon. Have a nice day. The message was signed, From your loving father. Mitch screwed it into a tight ball and threw it as hard as he could, but the cold night air didn't let it travel far. He gasped as the paper rolled back towards them, although there was no wind, not even a breeze to make it do so. As they stared, it slowly unscrambled itself. What the hell? John leaned forwards and picked up the paper, folded it, and dropped it into his pocket as though nothing strange had just happened. So, what are we going to do about this poor kid? Mitch whispered, after shaking his head in bewilderment. There is nothing we can do, John answered, and taking the knife from the boy's lifeless hand, stuck it into his waistband and started to walk back towards the gate. So, You mean we are going to just leave him there? Spurted Mitch in disbelief. That is just what I mean. But hell, Mitch began. Look, John yelled, rounding on him. I don't like it any more than you, but there is nothing we can do for him now, and telling the police or his parents would only complicate matters. Mitch knew that it made sense. But I still don't like it. It just ain't right, he mumbled stubbornly. More important, we have got some questions that need some answers, John replied in a grim tone. Mitch gritted his teeth. He wouldn't mind giving that son of a bitch a few kicks into the bargain, and he told himself. By the time they reached the house, a few clouds had appeared, and small flakes of snow drifted to the ground and melted slowly. But for every one that melted, 2 stuck firmly. The door was slightly ajar, and John made a John Wayne-type entrance, kicking it almost off its hinges. He was about to yell abuse at the lawman when 2 things riveted his attention. One was the broken banister. The second, and more important one, was the huge figure at the end of the hall, steadily pointing a double-barreled shotgun at his head. Chapter 16. John felt Mitch glide into him, and on seeing the sweating lawman with an unsteady finger on the trigger of the gun, he heard the reporter gasp a long drawn-out, "Shit!" Yes, shit indeed, buddy, Roy snarled. And that's just what you have walked into. Take it easy, Roy, John whispered softly. He could see that the man was well over the edge. In fact, the way his eyes stared blankly, it looked as though he had gone right over and was on his way down. Maybe we can help. Roy laughed loudly, a laugh that was full of despair. Help? Help who? The children, me? No, it's too late for either of us. We know you have been killing the children, but what I cannot understand is why. What the hell they could do to you, you sick bastard. The grip on Mitch's arm sent a pain through him that cut him short. Shut it, Mitch, John hissed. John's right, Mitchy boy. In fact, I think I will kill you now. Roy spat out the words and leveled the gun at the cringing reporter's head. Don't shoot him, John pleaded. Why add any more killings to your list? I don't think that sparing this creep's life is going to make my soul any more welcome in heaven, do you? Roy grinned. The seconds stretched an eternity, but the shot never came. Roy dropped the gun barrel slightly, so that it now pointed in between the 2 men, ready to shoot the first one that dared to move. John realized that the best thing he could do was to keep him talking. Why did you get me the sack, Roy? He asked softly. Ah, so you know, the lawman laughed. You really have been doing some detective work. Quite simple. I needed you back in Buckley. By why? John queried, still puzzled. Don't you know? Your daddy needs you, boy. John had had that feeling all along. Now he knew it. You see him? It was more of a statement than a question. Oh, I see him all right. The lawman spat, his face turning an angry purple. John could tell the man was going into a steadily deepening gloom. Is it for him? He shouted. Are you killing the children for him? Roy's face took on a hurt expression. Oh, John boy, you don't think I've been killing those kids? For a moment, John thought Roy really was hurt by the idea, but then he remembered the poor soul they had found that evening, and his voice hardened. Yes, I bloody well do think you have been killing them, and I think you and my dad killed them 30 years ago. He nearly choked on the word dad. Anger swelled up in the copper, and John thought that his head was going to explode. He had pushed him too far. Listen, son, your dad's killing them now, and he killed them 30 years ago. I'm not your son, John rasped, and maybe you are telling the truth about him killing those years ago, but there is no way that he is killing them now. He's dead. He didn't know what it was he had said, but the anger drained out of Roy. You have seen him, he sighed. You have felt him. John felt a chill crawl down his spine. Maybe it hadn't been a dream. And what about Cindy Rawlings? I suppose she was one of my father's little messengers, too. The lawman's eyes widened. Don't you mean Sandra? No, I mean Cindy, her sister. But Sandra had no sister. And believe me, I should know, Roy said. And something in his voice convinced John that he was telling the truth, which left the question of just who was Cindy, and did she ever exist? What did the girl look like? Roy asked. She looked like an older version of Sandra. I wonder, could it be? Roy mumbled to himself. Could it be what? John demanded. No, I stopped your father all those years ago, Roy went on, completely ignoring John's question. How did you stop him? I fixed his car and killed him, Roy winked. And you killed my mother too, snarled John, taking a step forward. I'll kill you, boy, Roy warned, and John stepped back. Yes, I killed Jenny too. I have wanted to die for that every day since, but I just ain't got the guts to do anything about it. John could see the sadness in his face and could have sworn that a tear glistened in the lawman's puffy eyes. So why did you kill her, if she meant so much to you? I didn't know that she would be with him that night. I saw how pissed he was and knew that Jenny was in for a hiding again, and after he hit her, he always went for a drive to find some poor kid to kill, so I fixed the car. But for some reason, my mother was with him, and you killed her too, John finished for him. Yes, and I've lived to regret it ever since. But if you stopped him then, why are you getting kids for him to kill? And why is he doing it now, after all this time? I think you know why I'm doing it. I can't stop him from getting to me, just like you could not stop him from getting to you. As for the reason, why, it's simple. He needs them. Roy sighed. Needs them. Needs them for what? John pressed him, truly puzzled. He needs their innocence to bring him back to this world. John felt the breath being knocked from his lungs by the impact of the words. Could he do it? Could he make his way back to this world? John now knew why he was back in Buckley. So you brought me back to stop him? Roy shifted uneasily. Well, not really. He wanted you back. But why? John screamed, impatience goading him. Well, firstly, he wanted the kids, Roy drawled, as though he was talking to someone slow on the uptake. And you might be pleased to know that he now has all he needs. Oh, I'm over the moon, growled John. And secondly, Roy carried on, ignoring the venom in John's voice, he needs me dead. And lastly, he needs your blood to complete the journey. So you are going to kill me and then grovel for your life, John sneered. No, not at all. I can't kill you. Your father's got to do that. Roy smiled. For the first time, hope began to flicker in John. And you can't kill yourself, so what you are saying is that we can stop him. I'm not saying that at all. You might be able to stop him, but I will be dead, and you will have killed me. Although John felt like he could gladly do just that at this moment, he knew that there was no way he was going to kill Roy. Well then, that's it. It's over. Because I'm not going to kill you, he asserted. Roy laughed out loud. You may think you are not going to kill me, but you will. John was getting really angry now. Come on, Roy. Let me take you in, and we will be able to get you help. You just don't get it, boy, do you? Roy screamed. Nobody can help me. I'm going to rot in hell, and you are going to put me there. Roy took a step back and swung the gun around, placing the end of the barrel into his mouth. He's going to do it. He's going to blow his bloody brains out, yelled Mitch. John raced forward to prevent him, and there was a deafening shot which echoed in the narrow hallway, stopping him in his tracks. John stared at the remains of the lawman and then at the dark patches climbing all over the walls. The naked light bulb wasn't bright and managed to hide most of the mess, but not all. John could see that the top of Roy's head had completely gone, and there was a jet of blood hitting the ceiling and cascading down onto the limp bulk below. Although limp, the figure was still standing, and as they watched, it seemed to pass the gun to one side, let out a soft moan, and then slide to the floor. John felt Mitch's hand on his shoulder. Well, he was wrong, wasn't he? About what? John replied, unable to drag his eyes off the dead cop. About you killing him, he was wrong. No, he was right. Look, mate, Mitch said comfortingly. You only tried to stop him. He killed himself. No, I killed him, John insisted, pointing to the floor. Mitch followed his finger and then saw it. Running across the hall, there was a thin wire which ran through a hoop and then went to another hoop beside Roy, and then it connected to the trigger of the gun. So when John had rushed forward, he had tripped the wire which set the trigger off on the gun, releasing the deadly shot. That was why it looked as though Roy was placing the gun to one side. When he fell, the gun was swung towards the banister on the wire. So Roy had been right after all. John had killed him. They had got out of Roy's place without touching a thing, and neither of them had gone near the body. Although Mitch had suggested it, John had put up a good argument to the chances that Roy could still be alive, the main point to his argument being that half his bloody head was missing. As they drove in silence, John's mind was racing 10 to the dozen. He was trying to make sense of what Roy had told him, and of what Roy hadn't told him. So he now knew that there would be no more children going missing. One small blessing of the whole affair. And, although Roy had not said as much, he had killed Henry Woods. But what could Woods have told him that was so important that it got him killed all these years later? All John could guess was that Woods knew it was Roy abducting the children, and he was scared that John would put a stop to it before the right time. And then there was the news that he was going to be killed by his father, his dead father. He felt like laughing at the very idea, but he knew that it was no laughing matter. And deep down he also knew that he wasn't going to be able to do anything to stop his death. He did have one option. He could take his own life and thus rob his father of his chance to return. But although he knew it was an option, that was about all it was. When it came to suicide, he just didn't have the bottle for it. He glanced at Mitch and shook his head. That wasn't an option either. Mitch noticed John looking at him from the corner of his eye. He knew his friend was worried, and a good reason he had too. Look, John, he said reassuringly. We can't take Roy's words seriously. It was just the ramblings of a mad man. Who's this we? John thought. Your life isn't in danger. But he knew he wasn't being fair. He had no reason to be bitter towards Mitch. Ramblings of a madman or not, he still went to a great deal of bother to make me kill him, John stated. But, Mitch said, wagging a finger. How could he be sure that I wouldn't be the one to rush forward and trip the trigger? Because my friend, John grinned, he knew as well as I did that you would be quite content to stand there and watch him blow his head off. Mitch just shrugged and gave a short laugh. Where are we heading anyhow? John asked. Actually, Mitch muttered, I really don't know. I so wanted to get away from that place that I didn't think of a destination. Maybe we should check on Maddie, John suggested. Do I detect a spark between you two? Mitch winked. John's face was solemn, and for a moment, Mitch expected an ear bashing. But after a short while, the clouds disappeared from John's eyes. "It's not that I wouldn't like there to be something between us," he whispered, more to himself than to Mitch. "But with all that's going on, how could there be?" He looked at his friend, his eyes hopeful that he would come up with an argument against the reason why there couldn't be anything between them, but his hopes were dashed. "I guess you're right," Mitch agreed, "but when it's all over there is nothing stopping it." "Nothing but the fact that I will be dead," snapped John. Mitch looked at the deflated man beside him and felt a pang of sorrow. There was no comfort he could offer. Although he would not say as much, deep down he thought there was little hope after all. How the hell do you fight a dead man? Out of the blue there was a police car behind them, siren wailing and its lights flashing. Shaking, Mitch pulled over to the side of the road. John felt the cheeks of his backside twitching as he clenched them tighter, trying to get a hold of his nerves. At the last moment, the police car swerved and went hurtling past. Mitch slumped forward and hit the steering wheel with his head. "Shit," he gasped. "Did that put the shits up me?" The rumbling from his stomach was the only response he got from John. "Look," John said, "I think that we are worrying over nothing. I mean, Roy's house is off the beaten track, so I don't think anyone would have heard the shot. He won't be missed until tomorrow, if he's missed then, and tomorrow's a long time off." Mitch knew what he meant. It was going to be a long night, what was left of it, at least for John. He was also right about no one hearing the shot. It had been loud in the hallway, but outside, it would only have sounded like a car backfiring. When they reached Maddie's, they were in two minds on whether to knock. The place was in complete darkness. Suddenly the curtain fluttered, and a moment later, Maddie appeared. The street was deserted, but they still raced to the door so as not to be noticed. John gave a final glance round to make sure, then dived inside after Mitch. As soon as they were through the door, Maddie turned on them. "I was so worried," she stammered. "I thought you were dead." John could see by her red-rimmed eyes that she'd been crying. "Let's go and sit down, and you can tell us what on earth gave you that idea," he said soothingly. "I nodded off," she exclaimed after a moment, "and saw a gun. I don't know who had the gun, but I saw that it was pointing at Mitch." Mitch was about to say something, but Maddie continued. "I saw you running and heard an explosion then." She looked at Mitch, tears once more rising in her eyes. "I saw you fall. There was so much blood." She let the sentence trail off. John glanced over at Mitch, and then back at Maddie. "Well, your version was almost right, but Mitch didn't fall." He told her what had happened since they had left the house earlier. "So the gun and everything you saw was right, except for the part where you saw Mitch fall," he concluded. "No, you don't understand," she protested. "I saw you both running away from the gun, and Mitch didn't just fall, he was shot. It was his blood I saw." A silence fell across the room while her words sank in. If she hadn't seen the events of that evening, then what had she seen? John stared hard at her, but in the dim light, it was difficult to tell what she was thinking. Suddenly, the room was no longer dim. It was completely awash in a bright yellow light, and a harsh voice broke the silence. "The house is surrounded by armed police. Come out with your hands up." They just sat there, unable to comprehend what was happening. Then the harsh voice came again. "John Lowe, come out with your hands up." Chapter 17. "What the hell are they doing here?" Mitch gasped. John looked at their faces in the strange yellow glow, and despite the situation, He felt a deep calm inside. I don't know how, but my guess would be that they have found Roy. But they couldn't have, stammered Mitch. We've only just left him. Well, whatever. I've got to go out there. Maybe we can bluff it, Mitch said. I'll go out there and tell them they have got the wrong place. John smiled. He could tell by Mitch's face that even he thought it was a crappy idea. No, whatever it is, I will have to face it. Then I'm coming with you, Mitch declared. No! John saw the startled look on his friend's face and added in a softer tone, what if what Maddie saw was a cop's gun, which is to say what will happen out there? So long as we don't run, it won't come true, Mitch replied stubbornly. John shook his head ruefully. No, come out now, or we will come in. The harsh voice called again. John opened the door and was instantly blinded by the powerful light. He heard someone telling him to get his hands above his head, but couldn't see where the voice came from. Take 5 steps forward, and then lie face down on the ground and place your hands behind your back. The voice screamed, still using the loudspeaker. With a voice like that, you don't need a loudspeaker, John thought, trying to visualize what the arsehole looked like. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his spine as a knee jolted it, and his arms were pulled so far back that he heard them snap. A pair of cuffs was slapped on, cutting off the blood to his fingers. He let out a whimper. Oh, this is just the beginning, another harsh voice snarled as he was dragged to his feet. Take it easy, John heard Mitch shout. Just what the hell is he being charged with? Just who the hell are you? And stay just where you are. I'm a reporter, and I want to know what's going on here. Mitch pulled out his ID. That don't mean shit. If you want to know anything, ring DCI Lang. The man spat over his shoulder as he threw John into the back of a waiting police van. I demand to know, Mitch yelled. Piss off. I'm going to report you. What's your name? DCI Lang. John struggled into a sitting position as the van sped away from the scene. What's going on? Why I've been arrested? He asked the dark figure sitting opposite him. I think you know, the man replied. John realized this wasn't the harsh voice he had heard before, although the same voice, it now sounded almost pleasant. But I don't know, he sighed. But deep down, he knew beyond doubt that this all had to do with Roy's death. Let's put it another way, the man said, leaning forward, revealing a hard, granite-like face. If you are guilty, a whole lot of parents are going to want to get their hands on you. As his words sunk in, John felt a sudden panic. It couldn't be. Did they think he was responsible for the children that have gone missing? No. He saved one, returned him home safe and sound. Could that be it? Could the mother have reported and they wanted to ask him a few questions? As much as he would like that to be the case, he knew enough about police work to realize that they did not send round a bleeding army if they only wanted to ask a few questions. No, they thought he was responsible, and they must have something to prove it to be able to muster up an army to come and arrest him. He shifted uneasily in the dark and felt something prod his leg. They hadn't searched him that good when they threw him in the back of the van, and he suddenly remembered the little green sword. He wriggled round until he could feel the sword's handle and slowly managed to pull it free. With his foot, he pushed it hard up the front of the van. When they stopped and the doors were opened, he was out like a shot, giving them no time to see the green object on the floor. Inside the station, he was uncuffed and ordered to empty his pockets. What I don't understand, John said to the stern-faced desk sergeant. I was arrested by armed police. who would mean that I am considered dangerous, yet I wasn't searched for any sort of weapon. The desk cop looked puzzled. Armed police? He turned towards the two cops who had brought him in and gave them an inquiring glance. It's true, the beaky-nosed one said. We were real surprised to see them, but you don't ask Lang any questions. Well, I'm going to ask some bloody questions, the red-faced sergeant spat. Right, let's get you into a cell. John followed him obediently, wondering just what the hell was going on. Why had this Lang bloke acted like he had? He had an hour to sit and wonder why. And when he met Lang's, the hate that filled the man's eyes was enough to freeze the heart of a snowman all over again. Mitch was marching round the room so energetically that Maddie was scared that she would have to replace the carpet before its time. Sit down, Mitch. You're making me dizzy. He threw himself into the nearest seat and sat poised like a cat ready to pounce on its prey. What are we going to do? Just what the hell are we going to do? He queried, his voice rising. There is nothing we can do until the morning, Maddie replied calmly. What have they arrested him for? That bastard wouldn't even tell me that much. Then, conscious of what he had said, he grinned at Maddie and added, Excuse my French. Oh la la. Maddie raised her hands in mock disgust. Such language. Mitch settled into the chair a bit more comfortably. I'll ring the station and try and find out what I can, Maddie declared, trying to relieve Mitch's unease. But I've tried already. They won't tell you anything. I'll tell them that I am his wife. But he's not married, and as far as I know, he never has been. Maybe they don't know that. She winked. They didn't know that, but it didn't do any good. The man on the other end was polite but firm. He couldn't tell her anything at this time. If she rang back in the morning, they would have something for her then. Right, let's make this easy, Lang growled. Where are the bodies? What bodies? I'll say it again. What have you done with the bodies of those poor kids? I don't know where any bodies are, John yelled. Lang got up from his desk and, standing in front of John, drew his hand back, then hit him full in the face, sending him flying across the room. John picked himself off the floor and, checking his mouth, found that it was bleeding freely. Look, I know my rights. You can't question me without a solicitor, or without someone else present in the room, he blurted out through his swollen lips. Yes, you are quite right. Lang smiled and moved up to John again. But what rights did Roy have? John suddenly felt a pain explode in his groin and sank to the floor, tears mixing with blood, forming a steadily growing pool round his legs. Chapter 18. John felt the hot pain in his arm as a bullet smashed into it, and it was the signal for him to move. He could feel the warm air against his cheek as another slug hurtled past, missing him by a matter of a fraction of an inch, and then he was on the cop. The pain in his shoulder was gone as he used his fists like clubs on the already beaten gunman. Before he realized what was happening, the man's face was a bloody pulp. John stared in horror. Had he done this? He cursed the limp body for turning him into a monster, but any sorrow or regret was quickly dispelled as he remembered the image of his friend flying through the air and hitting the ground like a discarded trash bag. He ran over to the still form and had to use all his willpower to look. It was as though someone had taken a tin of red paint and done a respray on the reporter. Only it wasn't red, not a red you see on films. It was more like purple. A wild thought sprang to mind. So blood's really purple. All this time you thought it was red, but no, it's purple. And shit still stinks, and we are up to our necks in it, an unsteady voice cracked. Mitch, John cried, wide-eyed, you're still alive. I wouldn't like to place bets on it, the reporter rasped. John looked down at the blood-strewn body and thought that he wouldn't like to bet on it either. By the wheezing sound that kept escaping from the bluing lips, he was sure that the bullet had punctured a lung at the very least. The blood that was flowing from his friend's mouth was frothing up, and it made it almost impossible for him to understand what Mitch was trying to say. Take it easy. I'll get you out of here, John soothed. Mitch shook his head slightly. No, just go before they come for you, he rattled out in between breaths. I'm not going to leave you, John argued. Just call an ambulance and piss off, will you? Mitch said, doing his best impression of a smile. John hesitated a moment, then started towards the house. Suddenly, he remembered that he had seen a mobile phone in Lang's car, and at least they wouldn't be able to trace the call on a mobile. At least he didn't think so. But then again, what would it matter if they did? The cop was still in the same position as John had left him, and he wondered if he had killed him. Funnily enough, the thought didn't worry him in the slightest. With the tip of his boot, he flipped the body over, and a low groan told him that the man was still alive, although John swore that if Mitch died, Lang wouldn't be far behind him. The call was abrupt. They wanted to know more details, but John had no intentions of staying on the line any longer than he needed to. Although he knew that he should get as far away from the place as possible, he didn't want to move until he knew that Mitch was going to be all right. He climbed over the gate and felt an icy finger claw at his chest. He took a deep breath, but even the air hurt his lungs. He just wasn't strong enough for this. He just couldn't take any more. He scrambled over the gate to the roadside again and felt the warmer air flow through his body. What's the matter? Don't like the cold? A voice mocked. John shot a look at the cop, but the body was still limp, and the eyes closed. The voice hadn't come from Lang, but from within. At the sound of sirens, John leapt over the gate for a third time. This time, the air remained the same. He scrambled along the hedge for 20 feet or so, and found a bare patch through which he could observe his friend clearly. Behind the ambulance were 3 cop cars and a meat wagon. It was a funny name for the van. What it really was a mobile cell. Knowing who the cell was for, after seeing Mitch being lifted into the ambulance, John made a move. Ducking as low as he could and still be able to run, he made for the shadows of the trees on the far side of the field. He heard voices behind. It was as though the cops knew his every move. He hadn't given any names, so how the hell did they know he was up here? The low clouds were doing a good job of blanking out the light, and hopefully the cold night would make the police search a half-hearted one. But he couldn't bank on it, so taking no chances, he set off at a low run once more. There he goes. A harsh voice broke through the night like a missile. No longer bothering to keep low, John set off at an Olympic sprint, tensing his back, waiting for the bullet to crash into his spine. But the bullet didn't come, only the sound of running feet and angry voices. He stole a glance behind and found that at least 3 coppers were as fast a runner as he was, no better, because even in that short glimpse, he could see them closing the gap between them. Suddenly, John ran headlong into a wall, but there was no wall, just a mist. But the mist had knocked him flat on his back. Getting to his feet, he made a run at the mist once more. Again, he was knocked on his arse. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. "Stay on the ground," a cruel voice ordered from behind. John tried to get to his feet, but fell headlong into the mist. This time the mist didn't knock him back. Instead, it seemed to suck him in, and straight away, John cursed himself for not staying on the ground as he was ordered. He knew that whatever those cops had in mind for him would be a picnic compared to what was about to happen. There was an eerie silence. The policemen after him were no longer in sight. John shot round expecting a hand to grab him at any moment, but the field was empty. Everything was bathed completely in a soft red glow, and the trees were no longer bare. They were now covered in lush green leaves. But as John watched, they seemed to take on a life of their own. They started to convulse, and as they curled up, they turned from reddish green to a burnt black. Then came a slight breeze, and the leaves vanished. John got to his feet and started walking round aimlessly. After all, where was he to go? The field was no longer the field that he knew. It now looked like a science from an old 50s movie about the planet Mars. That must be it, John thought. I fell, and I'm out cold, having one hell of a dream. He gave himself a sharp kick to the ankle, and the pain that shot through his leg was no dream. He was suddenly aware of hundreds, or what seemed like hundreds, of dark shadows darting all around him. They were just like the ones he had seen on his first day back in Buckley, and as he remembered the rotten faces of the zombies sprung to mind. Well, sod that, he said aloud, breaking into a trot. I'm not hanging about waiting for them to join the party. As he trotted, he felt as though he was on a trampoline. The ground seemed to rise with every footfall, and when his foot landed, the ground threw him one way and then the other. And if he tried to change direction, the floor just chucked him back in the direction he was going. It was as if he was being herded. The black forms stayed at a distance and remained on either his left or right. They no longer darted in front of him. John wasn't sure if they were there as guards or as some sort of protection for him. He shouted out, but got no reply. Suddenly, the red glow vanished and was replaced by a bright yellow light. John could see that the bright yellow light was coming from a large fire. As he drew nearer, he was aware of something digging into his back. He reached round and was surprised when he studied the object in his hand. It was the small green toy sword. He couldn't remember picking it up out of the police van. The last time he had seen the sword was when he hid it in the back of the police van that had picked him up, and he was certain that he hadn't been back to retrieve it. It must have been planted on him by that shit Lang. As if it wasn't bad enough that they thought he was a cop killer, he would have a hell of a job explaining the child sword. And if Lang had gone to the trouble of planting the object on him, then it was certain that they knew that one of the missing children had had the toy with him when he had disappeared. Yes, he would have one hell of a job explaining that one. Doing his best to rub off any fingerprints with his sleeve, he tossed the two aside. Suddenly, there was a strange, strangled noise from the marching divisions of ghost soldiers either side, and after a moment of darting about, they vanished. John felt the heat from the licking flames crawl across his skin, but a cold chill was traveling down his spine. An odd chanting sound filled the air, which seemed to be coming from all sides. But even as John looked around, he knew that it was coming from the other side of the huge fire. Skirting round the fire, he followed the chant. Slowly, the form of a child came into view, the girl from his dreams. The girl from the photograph, Sandra Rawlings. He knew now, without having to see, where the noise was coming from, who the noise was coming from. "Hi, son. Glad you could make it," rasped a deep, grating voice. John swirled round and was confronted by a huge figure, complete with snake's head and the strips of rotting flesh dangling from all over his body. Well, Dad, John responded sarcastically, I didn't really have much choice, did I? The death-like figure seemed to glide above the ground, and within moments was at John's side. John could smell the stench of death, and all that was evil. He tried to pull away, but a huge arm shot round his shoulders in what felt like a hug. John felt like vomiting, not just from the smell, but from the very idea that this creature was giving him a hug. Hell, he could see the mockery in the beast's eyes. What's the matter, son? Mad at me? Just what the hell do you want from me? John hissed, breaking free from the vice-like grip. Oh, hell be the right word, Johnny boy, his father grinned, wagging a finger, and I want you to join me. Why don't you just kill me and be damned? We can both rot in hell then. Hey, son, you got me all wrong, his father gasped, taking a few steps back in mock hurt. I don't want to kill you, and I certainly don't want you to join me in hell. But I thought that was your plan, John stammered, now uncertain. That's why you killed all those children, and that's why you had me kill Roy. Yep, that's true. Then I'm the final part, John yelled, his anger boiling. You need my blood to be able to return to this earth. Ah, yes. Now, yes, you're right there. I do need your blood to return, but I don't need you dead. John let the words sink in. You want to feed off me like bloody Dracula? You can piss off, he screamed. Tut, tut, son. Don't get that blood boiling, the creature laughed. You haven't heard my deal yet. Deal, John gasped. You think I would make a deal with you? I can make you immortal too. And I suppose I can wear the uniform as well, John spat, pointing with disgust at the decaying flesh tassels. Oh, this, the evil model swirled. This is a little number I like to wear when I am entertaining guests. John realized that throughout his exchange of words with his father, the young girl had not moved, nor spoken a word. Don't worry about her, the creature jibed, following his gaze. She cannot see or hear you. Then why is she here? And just who is she? John asked. She's here as my plaything to torment and torture when I feel like it. And as for who she is, haven't you guessed? I know that she's Sandra Rawlings, John said, puzzled. But I don't know who Sandra Rawlings is. Oh, you are thick, the monster rebuked. Join me, and you will discover the darkest secrets. Well, that is a mighty fine offer, but I will have to decline, John replied decisively. So I will be on my way, and I'll take the child with me. As he reached down to untie the girl, an ear-splitting roar erupted from the now infuriated fiend. I said I didn't have to kill you, it bellowed, but now I'm going to take great pleasure in crushing you. John ducked and nearly fell headfirst into the fire as the creature lunged, his face now an angry purple. Now come on, Daddy, don't be mad, John mocked bravely. Only he didn't feel brave. His heart was racing, pounding at his chest like a locomotive steam engine. As the drooling, skin-clad man attacked again, John threw himself to the ground and rolled into the tree trunk legs. It was like rolling into a rock, and John felt his ribs cry out in alarm. His father staggered a moment, and then slowly started to fall backwards into the licking flames. John watched as the hungry flames greeted their visitor, completely covering the body. But to John's amazement, the figure shot up straight and let out a long, cruel laugh. So you want to fry yaw, Papa, do yaw? He mocked. John turned to untie the girl once more, but she was gone. And in her place was a large rat, teeth bared, and a strange hissing noise coming from its flared nostrils. Before John could move, the rat threw itself into the air and attached its fangs to his neck. He reached for the creature, and despite the fact that normally he couldn't even touch a mouse, let alone a rat, He grabbed the hairy body and squeezed with as much strength he could muster. It did the trick. The rat let go of its grip, and John threw it into the fire with its master. "What's the matter?" his father said, stepping out of the fire. "Jerry only wanted to get to know you better." John took a step back and felt the blood flowing freely down his neck. It repulsed him to think that the rat had actually touched him, let alone bite him. He was about to wipe the blood off when the drooling man leapt at him. "Allow me," he slurped. John felt gross lips sucking at his neck, and a red, hot fire surged through his veins. This cannot be for real, he thought. It's like some crummy vampire movie. He was suddenly aware of something in his hand, and he gazed down in awe. It was the green sword. He didn't know how, but it was in his hand once more. For it to keep returning, there must be a reason. Although John felt silly, he lunged at the feasting monster, and to his astonishment, the sword went easily through everything in its path. His father screamed in agony and reeled backwards. "It's too late, son," he gasped, and then he was gone. Only a foul odor was left in his wake. John felt the air knocked out of his lungs, and a cold mist fall all around him, making him cringe in pain. When he opened his eyes, he was now about 10 yards behind his search party. So keeping low to the ground, he started to backtrack, his mind reeling. Could it be true? Was that his entire father needed? Could he now return to the world to carry on with his evil practice? And if so, who could stop him? John reached the hedge and skirted it the length of the field, and although there was an easy exit there, he opted for the more painful path and climbed, dragged and scratched his way through the dividing hedge and into the adjoining field. After about 15 minutes, he was well away from the search party and on the outskirts of town. All kind of thoughts ran through his mind, but none of them of any use. He couldn't go to the house, that was for sure, and it was certain that they would be watching Mattie's place. Of course, that was it. He would go to Mitch's. He wondered how his friend was doing, and the thought made him angry and filled him with more determination. Reaching some houses, he darted into the back alleyway, and finding a gate unlocked, and also by 100-to-1 chance, a shed unlocked, he rolled up into a ball and made the shed into his home for the night. He had decided that he would be better off moving in the daylight. As sleep was about to claim him, he had a sudden urge to call Mattie. Every nerve in his body cried out that she was in danger. Chapter 19. He tried telling himself that Mattie was fine and that he was worrying over nothing, but he felt that it was not just nothing, that something was wrong, and no matter how hard he tried, sleep evaded him. "To hell with this," he mumbled, leaving the sanctuary of his hiding place. The night sky was like deep velvet, with 1,000 diamonds splattered across its soft texture. And these diamonds radiated light, so much light that it was almost day. The only clouds visible that night came from John's mouth every time he breathed, which was something he had to do, even though he felt that every such cloud was like sending out smoke signals to the police who were searching for him. "Hey guys, I'm down here, come and get me." His last breath cried as he half walked, half jogged down the deserted sidewalk. He remembered the streets of Buckley well, and was glad that nothing much had changed. He wasn't happy, however, when he rounded the next corner, and instead of seeing the phone box, he remembered when he was a kid, there was now a statue. It just loomed over him, mocking him. John swore at it and jogged past without seeing who it was of. The next phone box, he remembered, was still there. And as he picked up the receiver, He wasn't surprised to hear the dialing tone. After all, the vandals would not bother with this one. And well, it was just across the road from the bloody police station. John felt totally naked standing in the box, but he also felt a rush of excitement at his little show of defiance. He felt the knot in his stomach tighten when, after what felt like a lifetime, the phone was answered. But the voice on the other end wasn't that of Maddie. It was a stern, harsh voice. "Who is this?" it demanded of the silence. John felt like yelling, "I know who I am, but who the fuck are you?" But instead, he asked feebly, "Is Maddie there pleased?" "Who is this?" the voice repeated, belligerently. John had a sudden thought that maybe this was a boyfriend. "Who are you and where's Maddie?" he snapped back, just as truculently. "I'll ask the questions," the voice barked. He knew now that the voice on the other end belonged to a cop. It was a bloody classic cop quote. So his feelings were correct. Something had happened. But what? Was she dead? He felt his body cry out in denial. He slammed the phone down in its cradle and gave the glass box a hefty kick. The glass groaned a little, then bent the toe of his cowboy boot back, sending a pain shooting through his foot. He yelled out and kicked it again. He cursed himself for the second onslaught and cringed at the bloody racket he was making. Glancing over his shoulder at the cop shop, he saw, with relief, that no one was coming to investigate the strange man fighting with the telecom box. Sinking his head down deep into his shoulders, John resumed his half-walk, half-trot, only now he had the added extra of a limp. He realized that it could be dangerous to go to Maddie's house, but he didn't know what else he could do, or what he was going to do when he got there, for that matter. He saw headlights coming his way and instinctively dived over the nearest garden wall. Seeing the police car vanish round the corner, he congratulated himself on his intuition. If he had been just that little bit slower, he could have ended up in the cells and of no use to Maddie. A voice chirped up in the back of his mind. "Who is to say you are any use to her anyway?" John closed the thought out completely. Although he had no way of knowing for sure, he was certain that she hadn't had an accident, and whatever had happened to her was his fault. His fault because he hadn't stopped his father, and it was his blood that had brought him back. Maddie's house was in the next street, so he decided to approach it commando style. Ducking down a driveway, he started to make his way through hedges, fences, and 6 bloody walls. The back gardens were in shadows, which did a little bit for his confidence. A little, but not much. With his back as tight as he could get it to the brickwork, he slowly edged forward until he could see Maddie's house opposite and still remain in the shadows. The house seemed all right at first glance, and John was tempted to walk straight over to it, but he held back. Which was a good thing, as 2 policemen, whispering together, came into view and took up residence outside the front gates. Why are they in full view if they are trying to catch me, John thought. And another thing, why had the cop answered the phone? If anything, that would scare him off. As John strained his eyes, he noticed something strange spout the front door. Well, strange wasn't the best word to use, but the fact that the front door was no longer on its hinges, but now carpeted, the pathway, was bloody strange indeed. If somebody was going to kick the door in, which is the way that it opens, into the house, then the door would have been lying inside the hall. But the way it looked was as though it had been kicked from the inside and landed on the path. And as John could now see, had taken the whole doorframe with it. John knew, without doubt, that his father had played a visit upon Maddie. But why? Well, that was simple, to get at him. But more to the point, How did he know about her? Could his father read his mind? He seemed to be one step ahead all the time. Had he been running his life all these years? It sure would account for all the shitty luck he had had. He shrugged this idea off. It would be too easy to blame all his past failures onto his, up to this point, unknown father. John stared across at the policeman as his mind reeled with unwelcome thoughts. I've got to find out what's happened, he told himself. Maybe I can help you with that one, a voice whispered. John whirled round, but the driveway behind was empty. He turned back to the two cops. Maybe one of them had spoken, but they were still standing outside the house. As John stared at them, he realized that something was not right. The little clouds had disappeared. He had let out a long breath, and a cloud of frosty air bellowed into the night. He glanced at the cops, but he still couldn't see any clouds. And another strange thought hit him. They hadn't moved, not an inch. He reached down and found a small stone, and after a moment's debate on whether to throw it at one of the cops, he flung it at the wall behind. The sudden crack split the night sky, and John gritted his teeth, expecting them to come rushing over at any moment. But they didn't move. John stepped out into the light, but neither of them took any notice of him. He suddenly felt that he was the only survivor on Earth, or that he had sidestepped into a parallel dimension. Each step seemed to be on a cushion of air as he floated towards the house. His legs hardly moved. It felt as though he was on the end of a line, and that someone was slowly winding him in. As he drew close to the two statues, he reached out and touched the nearest one. As his hand landed on the man's face, the flesh seemed to ripple like a bowl of water, and John's hand went straight through. He pulled his hand back quickly and examined it. It was dry, but as he rubbed it, he felt an electric shock drive through his body. It wasn't a bad shock, but he still felt as though his hair was standing on end. He studied the man's face. It looked like glass, and there was no ripples and no indication that John's hand had just been visiting. He continued up the path and stopped dead. The door was back in its rightful place. Panic hit him and he turned to run. But instead of seeing the two police statue forms, he was now confronted by a wall of mist, which felt as though it was challenging him to try and run through it. John decided to go on. He reached out for the door handle, but that too rippled like the policeman's face, and his hand disappeared. John remembered seeing a film, one of the Nightmares on Elm Street sagas, where the very same thing happened, and Freddy was waiting on the other side. And John knew that his very own Freddy was waiting on the other side for him, and he felt a chill rush through his bones. Taking a deep breath, he charged through the door. He felt as though a million fingers were trying to claw at him, but finally they gave up, and he fell through into the other side. Freddy wasn't waiting for him on the other side. No one was waiting for him. The house was just a house, just like he remembered it. The only thing that felt different was the cold that was enveloping him. It had now completely covered the front door. John knew that he was being herded, just like cattle. To the slaughter? As he listened, a sinister laugh came echoing down the stairs. "Glad you could make it, boy," a voice rattled after it. "Why don't you come on up and join us?" John placed his foot on the first step and had the feeling of being a condemned man climbing up to the gallows. His footfalls made no sound. Just like outside, he felt that he was walking on air. As he arrived at the top landing, he felt lightheaded and reached out for the banister to steady him. But just like everything else, this too rippled and swallowed his hand. Blinking rapidly, he regained his balance. So he wasn't really in the house. Was it a dream? Or had he really gone into another dimension? The laugh was coming from the room straight ahead. John guessed it was a bedroom. Without even trying the door, he walked straight through it, once more feeling the tiny claws grasping his body. He emerged on the other side with a slight pop and shivered involuntarily, and just as he had expected, there was his now familiar skin draped, foul-smelling father. "Hi, Dad," he said sarcastically. "So what's new?" "Hi, son. So glad you could make it." The skin creature smirked in a mock welcome and moved away from the bed to reveal a peacefully sleeping Maddie. John gasped and moved forwards, but breathed a little easier when he saw that she didn't show any obvious sign of injury. "Doesn't she look so sweet and innocent?" his father drooled. John was bewildered. Was Maddie here and the police are guarding her? Or was she a dream just like him? As if trying to answer his own question, he reached out and touched the sleeping figure. Unlike anything else he touched, Maddie did not ripple, but his hand didn't meet with a solid form. Instead, it went into her shoulder and disappeared, and the space that it had taken inside her body disappeared also. The more he reached into her, the more they both started disappearing. He pulled his hand back quickly as a thought shot through his mind. "Maybe you're hurting her. Maybe even killing her," it shrieked. A cold laugh ripped through his senses, and he glared at the foul creature watching him with obvious amusement. "Oh, son, I can see you're confused," he smirked. "I know. Am I here? Or am I dreaming? Is she real? Or is she a dream? Or are we both dreams? Oh, so many questions." John felt the hatred swell up inside him and threatened to explode. He fought the feeling and managed to contain it, but knew that he would draw on it later. "Okay, I'll try and help you," his father sighed, as though he was doing John a huge favor to start with. "You're not here. Well, not at this moment. What you see is what has happened, so in that case, I suppose you are not really talking to me. Oh well, on with the show then." Before John could say anything, his father had produced a skeleton hand with razor-sharp nails and caressed it across the sleeping woman's face. John stared in horror as 4 tiny wounds opened up and the red liquid seemed to roll out onto the white cheeks before trickling down the neck and making a nasty mess on the sheets. "Let me explain, Johnny boy," his father reeled on him as he took a step forward. "I'm not here either. You can't touch me. It seems that the small amount of blood I had from you wasn't enough to bring me back." "So how come you can touch her, and why?" John yelled, his voice reaching a peak and bursting out. "Well, that was a blessing," the creature smiled. "There, I was not knowing what I was going to do, when suddenly I felt someone dreaming about me. Oh, and you. Not just anyone, but someone with really talented powers. But sadly, she doesn't know it. Otherwise, she most certainly would not have dreamt about me. But the thing is, she did, and here I am." Snarling, John leapt at the huge figure, but never reached it. He left the ground, even moved towards his father, but that was as far as it went. He was back outside the bedroom door. Was the dream over? Was he now inside the house for real? He tried the door handle and felt the ripple once more and pushed on inside. "Tut, tut, that was naughty," the figure laughed, wagging a skeletal finger towards him. "You are here to watch, not to participate." The creature pulled the covers back and slashed at the still sleeping form on the bed. The flowers on Maddie's nightdress turned a red and then vanished. Still, Maddie never woke up. John was thankful for that. If she was still asleep, then she couldn't be feeling any pain, could she? The snake-headed creature now proceeded to rip the bed covers to shreds and sling them in all corners of the room. The wardrobe and whatever else got in the way was the next to feel old Snakey's wrath. John suddenly realized that although he was watching this mass destruction going on, he was seeing it, but not hearing it. It was as though he was watching a silent movie. Another thing that caught his attention was weird, wired even for him. The furniture was bleeding too. The walls, carpet, and ceiling were completely caked in blood. The whole room looked like a slaughterhouse, and the smell of death that filled the room brought bile to John's lips. He struggled to keep the vomit down. He remembered the last time when it cut short his dream, and he didn't want this dream cut short. He tried desperately to come up with an idea that would save Maddie, but what could he do? He had no way of stopping his father, and his father seemed intent on showing him exactly what he had done. John looked at the sleeping Maddie, and to his surprise, although there was still a hell of a lot of blood, the wounds on her cheeks seemed to be healing, so maybe his father couldn't hurt her after all. He was just making him see his worst nightmare. Although Maddie's face had returned to normal, the room still remained a mess, and the blood that covered the place was still there, just about on everything. John looked down at himself and realized, with horror, that he too was covered in the foul-smelling liquid. Although it looked like blood, it didn't smell like blood. It smelled like nothing John could imagine. "Well, son," Snakehead snarled, in between hurling a table lamp at the far wall, "it looks as though your friend is looking a little better." He took a swipe with the razor claw and opened up the flesh on Maddie's face once more. Although John felt his stomach churn, he told himself that it was all right, that it wasn't happening. Maddie could not feel a thing. The creature turned its evil glare towards John. "So that's what you think?" he growled, and reached over to Maddie. He put a large hand round her throat, dragged her out of bed, and held her, feet dangling above the carpet. Maddie tried to scream, but the scream was just like a breath of air as the huge hand tightened its grip. Now John had his doubts. Although she had not opened her eyes, Maddie looked as though she was feeling the pain. Panic rushed through John. What could he do? He was about to dive at his father once more when an idea hit him. Instead of throwing himself at the beast, he dived into the dangling Maddie. He could see their bodies disappearing as they joined together. He hadn't a clue what would happen, but all he could think about was that she would vanish. She would no longer be in the evil grip of his father. Suddenly the room faded away, and he was in total darkness. He couldn't feel anything around him. He reached out for Maddie, but there was nothing. He was simply floating in a complete void. Suddenly, a hollow laugh split through the darkness. "Well done, son," the voice bellowed. "You did just exactly what I knew you would do. You were right. I couldn't touch her, but thanks to your quick thinking, you have now transported her into my world. But there's not enough room for the both of you." A bright light came crashing forth and hit John full in the body, and he felt himself flying for a moment, and then a sharp pain shot through his back. His eyes felt like lead as he passed out. Chapter 20. As the misty veil lifted, he found himself staring at the two policemen outside Maddie's house. He was in the driveway opposite, and he quickly ducked back into the shadows as he tried to gather his thoughts. A thin bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, despite the biting November cold. Was he even in the house? Or did he dream it all? He hadn't dreamt it, he decides. With all the things that had been happening, he was bloody sure of that. So if he hadn't dreamed the whole thing up, then that brought him back to the subject of Maddie. What the hell had happened in the house? He remembered jumping into her and seeing her fade, and him for that matter, so it left the question, where had she faded to? To gray. What? To gray, a voice said inside his head, and the words from a song from the past sprang to mind. He cursed himself for the stupid thoughts that had invaded his mind at a time like this. Maybe not gray. He spoke aloud. Green. It was so obvious that it had to be the place. After all, the field had been the cause of all his problems. It all boiled down to the bloody field. So where else could she have been taken? John slipped back behind the house, without the two coppers opposite, ever knowing he had been there. Would this nightmare ever end? He wondered. Why didn't he just go up to the field and say, "Hi, Dad, take me," and be done with it? But he knew that he wasn't going to do that. Was it because he was a coward? He didn't think so. Not that he was a brave man by a long chalk, no. It was just that he had a hatred burning inside him, now that was egging him on. So many children had died, and so many people had been hurt by their deaths. And all at the hands of his father, he felt ashamed. And although it was nonsense, he felt to blame. The guilt of his father. That was a laugh. Until recently, he hadn't even been able to remember what that son of a bitch even looked like. God, how he wished he could make it return that way. Now all he saw was his father's face, and he wanted to smash that face until it was nothing more than the dead skins that hung off his body. The thought of Mitch lying in some hospital bed, fighting for his life, maybe even dead, sent a rage hurtling through John's body, giving him a deeper inner strength. He quickened his pace, retracing his steps from what felt like a lifetime ago, keeping a careful watch for any police, but being a little more reckless than he had been on the way to Maddie's house. Now that he knew what had happened to her, or at least felt he knew, he had a purpose, a job to do, and this was one job that he had to do right. John made good time and reached the lane that led up to his house without incident. As he approached, he could see the police car parked by the gate. He searched along the hedge until he found the hole in which he had left by earlier. Ignoring the thorns ripping at his skin, he dived through. As he emerged out on the other side, he felt a strange sensation was about him. The sky, that had been clear just a moment ago, was now clouded over, and he felt spots of rain, the size of his fist, fall suddenly. Within moments he was soaked to the skin. But strangely, he didn't feel wet. He stood up, not bothered about being seen. If he was right, then there was no one to see him anyhow. He had the feeling that he was now in another time. He had just stepped through a void, and the cops were no longer outside the field waiting for him. To prove a point, he tried looking over the hedge, but the hedge was now taller and a lot thicker, with lush green leaves. This, and the fact that although it was raining, it was still warm, told John that, at a guess, it was either August or September. It definitely wasn't late November anymore. He headed for the cluster of trees where all the bodies had been found. As he neared them, he could now make out flames stabbing up at the night sky, throwing off tiny sparks like shooting stars. As he drew closer, he could see the scene clearly. It was the scene from 1,000 nightmares that he knew so well. As he approached, the skin-clad figure stopped his dancing and turned to greet him. "Well, hi, son. I knew you would come." "Where's Maddie?" John demanded. "Oh, she's not here," his father grinned. "I'm sorry if that's what you was expecting." "Then where is she, you bastard?" John hissed. hatred filling his voice. You won't really understand this, but she's at home. But she disappeared. I made her disappear, John stammered. You did, but she's still there. It's just that you can't feel or see her. He gave an evil laugh at John's puzzlement. She'll come back when you're dead. Don't worry. Oh, so you have decided that you're going to kill me now, John mocked, trying to sound braver than he felt. It's nothing personal, but the mere drop of blood I had from you been enough to bring me back. So I've decided that I'll take it all, if it's all the same to you. Over my dead body, John yelled, and then suddenly felt foolish. Well, that's what I had in mind, his father laughed. Please help me, a soft voice whispered. John noticed that the girl in the chair was awake and could clearly see him. Untie her, he ordered. Or what? The skin-clad figure mocked. You will make me? Take it easy, Sandra. I'll help you, John soothed. Oh, you know her then? The beast said, surprised. Yes, I know who she is, Sandra Rawlings. Just one of the children you killed 30 years ago. John hissed. Not just one of the children, his father pointed out. She was the last, just like you will be. John didn't grasp the point of his words. But if I stop you now, then she won't be the last, and there won't be any more after her. Oh, my dear boy, you can't stop me, the foul-smelling figure scoffed, and I must say you really are thick. John looked puzzled. I followed everything I had to do, his father went on. I killed all those brats. I killed a close friend, then finally drank her blood. He pointed at the cowering child and yelled furiously. I was meant to become immortal, but as you know, it didn't work. Why would her blood make you immortal? John asked, bewildered. Because she's your sister, you dumb shit, the beast screamed. The words cut into John like a knife, making him incapable of a response. You really hadn't worked it out, had you? His father mocked. Your mother tried to get her away from me, but I found the family who had adopted her. But it didn't work. Then why aren't you dead and resting in peace? Growled John, recovering himself a little. Now that is a good question, his father mused, and I have no answers. For years after I killed you, sister, and in turn was killed myself, I lay dormant, unable to do anything but let time go by, and watch as your sister tried, in her puny way, to get you to come and lay her soul to rest. But when you moved away, even she couldn't reach you. John watched as his father tried to find the words to tell his story. It was almost as if it pained him. But when your aunt died, Sandra here received a new lease of life. She found you, and could tell that you had no intentions of coming back home. So the little darling got you the sack. So where else could you go? Being a bum and all, but home. But she didn't know that, like her, my powers had grown, and I had already set my plan into action. But I let her do all the work, and she only realized the truth when it was too late. So now I will be able to have my 2 offspring's blood. And this time, I won't fail. My reward will be immortality. You're wrong, John yelled. I'll stop you, and you will rot in hell. Before you do anything rash, his father jeered, think of the downside for you. Downside for me? What downside could there be? John screamed. Well, let's say you manage to kill me, and then you won't exist. You see, at this moment in time, you haven't been born, so if you kill me, then you kill yourself as well. His father grinned, pleased at the impact of his words. No, you're lying, John said finally. I can clearly remember the night you was killed, so I must have been born then. Oh, I am sorry, his father mocked. Did I lead you to believe I was killed straight after you sister's death? My mistake. You see, your mother and Roy didn't find out about it until a long time after. I guess I will have to take the chance that you are laying, said John, after a moment's thought. And even if you are not, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. Before his father could respond, John threw himself across the fire and took the huge figure by surprise. Although he received the full force, his father didn't go down. He swayed slightly, but remained on his feet, while John slid to the ground, winded. The beast drew back his foot and kicked John, sending him sprawling across the wet grass. John heard his ribs break before he felt the pain, and when the pain came, it felt like no other pain he had ever known. His whole side felt as though it was on fire, and as he tried to get to his feet, a warm gush of blood vomited from his mouth, almost choking him, sending another bolt of agony to his ribs. Before he could get to his feet, the brute was beside him, sending another kick to the side of his face. John felt the cheekbone crumble under the heavy attack, and stars cascaded forth, blocking out his vision. And the next blow. This time, the foot landed on his arm, breaking it cleanly in two, and through the haze that surrounded him, John could hear the evil laugh. You thought you were a match for me? I will deal with you after I've dealt with your sister. John heard the cry of alarm come from the small girl as the beast made his way over to her. He fought desperately to clear his head, but knew that at any moment he might black out. Clutching under his shirt, he felt the warm handle of the green sword. It was only a kiddie's toy, but it had helped him once before. That was in a nightmare, though. This was no longer a nightmare, and this was real. He managed to get to his feet as the snake monster reached the captured child. I'm not finished with you, John screamed, his words coming out slurred from his now lopsided mouth. His father turned impatiently, pissed off by the delay. Seeing the puny sword in John's hand, he let out a harsh bellow of laughter. Do you really think you can stop me with that? He spat. With more strength than he had known he possessed, John lunged at the skin-clad tormentor and felt with pleasure the tiny plastic blade slice through skin and hit bone. His father screamed out in rage and grabbed John by the throat, shaking him like a rag doll. 100 visions cascaded through his mind. The digging up of the bodies, the cats, the strange woman calling herself Cindy Rawlings. Could she have been Sandra? The death of Roy, the shooting of Mitch, and of Maddie. He couldn't let all this in vain. He struck out wildly with the plastic sword, noting with satisfaction that it was finding its mark. The hands round his neck slackened, and John easily knocked them away. He looked into the eyes of his father. Now the mockery had gone from those eyes. It was replaced with pain, something that John had never thought could happen. John thrust the sword into the huge man's stomach and twisted it like a corkscrew. The skins that hung from his body were now a dark red, but it wasn't the blood from his victims. It was his own blood, and his father stared down at it, unable to believe it. How can this be? He stammered. How can an innocent child's toy do this? John suddenly realized how, because it belonged to an innocent child, a child guilty of nothing, but you still took his life. As John watched the creature sink to the ground, a loud crack of thunder rolled overhead, and the rain came down even more heavily, mixing with the blood, forming a large pool round the sorry sight on the floor. The fur crackled as the rain fell into it, and a bolt of lightning fell from the sky, missing the fallen creature by a matter of feet. John smelt the scorched earth and watched in horror as it opened up and about 10 or 12 dark forms spewed from the gaping hole. They were the same creatures he had seen on his first visit to the field, and they darted all around in the darkened sky, only their fierce red eyes showing. John held the sword up in an attempt to ward them off, but they made no effort to attack him. He edged his way over to the sobbing girl, who was watching the specters intently, but showing no fear. The plastic blade cut easily through the ropes that bound her, and she fell into his arms. Suddenly the night sky was filled with an ear-piercing howling, and the dark forms dived down onto the creature in the foul skins. The snake's head upon his own now looked comical. The creature screamed as they completely smothered him, and within moments, he was gone. The hole in the ground had closed over too, but sticking out of the ground was a small strip of animal skin, soaked in a red dye. This was all that was left to prove that the creature had ever been there. John reached out to pick it up, but could only watch as it slowly slid down into the earth. "I think we should be going back," a voice said, cutting into John's thoughts. He opened his eyes. The rain had gone, and it was now light. He turned to face the speaker and was confronted by Sandra Rawlings, or at least an older version of Sandra. She smiled at him and set off down the field. "Mom and Dad will only get worried." John started to follow her, but said nothing. "And you know how big Roy thinks that the police force have got better things to do than look for us, even if it did mean more over time for him," she continued in a mocking tone. John's thoughts were working overtime. His mom and dad, she was still alive, and his dad was Roy. Suddenly, it all fell into place. The reason the creature's plan hadn't worked when he drank Sandra's blood, and his own, it was simple. They never were his children. Roy had been their father all along. And somehow, in his own way, he had been protecting John all these years, until in the end, he had even given his own life. As they drew closer to the house, John could see his mother and Roy waiting for them. "Come on, son, you don't want to be late today," Roy yelled, waving. John waved back without thinking, and then noticed that everyone was dressed up in their Sunday best. He glanced down and saw that he also was wearing a fine suit, and in his lapel was a large red carnation. John followed his now jogging sister and realized that he wasn't in any pain. In fact, he had never felt better, and as he ran along, all the events of that night and of his past life slowly melted away. By the time he reached the gate and vaulted over it, he had no knowledge of his previous existence. He had only one thing on his mind: the wedding, his wedding, and he knew that he could not be late, for today was the happiest day of his life. Today Maddie was going to become his wife. The end.